discussion. So they've got a small, I think they've got a little PowerPoint with some kind of information they want to tell us.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about the minutes of the previous meeting. Anybody have any additions or corrections? If not, can I have a motion that they be approved?
I approve the minutes as presented.
Okay, Gary with Warren as a second.
Okay.
Is that correct?
Good by me. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
before we go further, as a reminder, when people speak, they have to identify themselves because we have a telephonic option as well.
Yes. I remember being told that previously, and I forgot again. This is Commissioner Lauber. At this point in time, we invite, encourage, and welcome general public comment on non-agenda items. Is there anybody that has public comment on non-agenda items?
And if you do have a comment, use the raise hand function. If you click participants and get the list, you'll get a raise hand function, and then we'll go in the order.
Does that mean there isn't any, Jason?
I have not seen anybody raise their hand at this point.
All right. Well, we have the department report. Chris, do you have anything for today?
Chris Tymason, I do not, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Well, then we're going to roll right into Levi's presentation. That didn't take very long. You there, Levi? I see, but he's muted.
All right, now can you hear? So this is Levi Jaster Emporia. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. So we're going to talk about the big game permanent regulations today, and August is when we generally introduce them to allow for public comment on them. So I will go ahead and jump into 115.4-2, which is the general provisions for big game. Last year we changed this to modify the proof of sex regulation for antlerless deer and elk to allow hunters to voluntarily help prevent spreading chronic wasting disease, because this allowed them to leave the head and spine at site of harvest rather than have to move it just to prove sex for antlerless animals. Currently, with this year, we don't have any changes proposed for this regulation. So the next one is 115.4-4, which is legal equipment for big game. And last year we added the lock draw devices to archery as general equipment, mostly to help clean up some of our regulations and not make the one or two people that get those special permits a year have to go through all that paperwork. As far as big game for this year, there were no proposes or no changes proposed for this regulation. And then the next one for 115.4-6 is deer management units. We changed this last year also to expand unit 19 to have a little more uniform of management objectives and actions, and to try and simplify the boundary for hunters also at the same time. But we have no changes proposed. Well, we will be proposing a change to this one, I believe. Later, it was discovered after we wrote the book. There's a bit we're going to have to clean up on one portion of the boundary where it doesn't actually, there's a road name not included that we have to add to make sure it completes the full polygon. I don't know if that road changed in the past or what, but it just doesn't quite connect. So we'll do that to clean up the regulations. I've been working with Chris Tymeson on what to do with that. So we will be bringing a unit change for 19 this year just to clean that up. So that would then take me to 115.4-11, which is big game and turkey permit applications. We haven't changed the application process, and we're not discussing any changes for big game anyways. So no changes proposed for this regulation. The last one in 115 is 4-13, which is the deer permits, descriptions, restrictions. Starting in 2016, so 4 years ago, we didn't offer any either species antlerless only permits due to concern with mule deer populations. We're planning to continue doing that. The populations, while stable, haven't recovered to the point that we'd want to do that across their range. And so currently for deer permits and descriptions, there's no changes proposed for that regulation. And that would conclude the 115 general provisions, general big game. And I'll take questions.
I learned a new word, polygon. Okay, are there any questions for Levi? All right, this is Gerald, by the way. I think on this item we have 1, 2, or 3 additional presentations, but do you want to talk about CWD first?
I can, Mr. Chairman.
And see here the presentations on equipment and such, and then we'll talk about CWD.
We could do that if that's what you'd prefer, Mr. Chairman. We also have the Deer 25 series regulations we have to cover for seasons.
Well, go ahead and cover that first then.
Okay. Levi Jaster, the Emporia, these are the Deer 25 series regulations, which set season dates. Jason, I have a slide with a calendar type thing to show if you don't mind pulling that up. Okay, so this calendar shows the days that are proposed for the 2021 to 2022 seasons for deer statewide. And we aren't really doing much outside of what nothing outside of what we've done this coming season. And most states are following what we've done traditionally. The current option for the January seasons follows what we're doing this season in that there'll be 3 lengths, 9, 16, and 23 days by units. So the recommendation for the proposed season dates for deer hunting for 2021 to 22 is the youth and disability would be from September 4th through the 12th. That's in the yellow on the calendar there. The early muzzleloader season would be September 13th through September 26th. That's in that blue color on the calendar. Archery would fall September 13th through December 31st. That's the green color. The pre-rut whitetail antlerless only firearms season is around Columbus Day, which can be a holiday, so we include that Monday. So that's the brown, that's the 9th. So October 9th through October 11th. The regular firearm season starts on the traditional Wednesday after Thanksgiving. So that starts on December 1st through December 12th. That's the orange color. The first extended whitetail antlerless only season falls January 1st through January 9th of 2020. That's kind of the red polka dotted color. The second extended whitetail antlerless only season is January 1st, 2022 through January 16th, 2022. That's the red polka dotted and the blue stripes. The third extended whitetail antlerless only is January 1st through January 23rd, 2020. And that's the red polka dotted, the blue stripes, and the orange slashes. And then the extended archery season in DMU 19 is January 24th through January 31st, 2022. And that is the green slashes at the bottom on the calendar. And so those are the proposed statewide season dates for deer for the 2021 and 20 through 2022 season. And with that, I'll take questions.
Levi, this is Commissioner Spohr. Can you give me what the department's thought is behind having youth season and disabled people's season so early in September?
In some years, that is good weather. It's before stuff starts for youth a lot of times too. Often, many years they get into fall sports and stuff. It's also before other hunters are out, gives them the first chance at it. It also then enables whoever's going to take them as a or help them with it as a youth hunter. They don't have the ability to hunt before that, so they tend to be free and so they're not feeling like they have to give up an opportunity. And so we hope it encourages that.
I'm still receiving lots of complaints that the crops are still out and the young hunters aren't very successful. I voiced that opinion a couple times in other meetings, and just letting you know that I think there's a better time to hunt. Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions or comments for Levi from the commission? This is Gerald. I hear a lot of comments from muzzleloader hunters about the same thing, Troy. I don't exactly know what the best option is, because everybody would rather have it when it's a little cooler, and we try to give the youth an opportunity to where they don't have the competition and the game has not been spooked around yet. So we might want to rethink that from time to time and see what it can be done, because it is pretty hot sometimes.
The big complaint we have in the western half of the state is the milo and the corn crops are still, obviously still out in the fields, and it just makes the hunting, way more challenging. I don't know that anybody's ever said anything about hot or too hot or anything like that. It's just, it's mainly the height of the crop that's not allowing the kids to be successful.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, this is Mike Miller. And I'm not defending those dates, but I was around when we set up the first youth seasons, and Levi summarized it really well. We were trying to give youth the first shot at it before the deer had been hunted. The disabled hunters a lot of times can't handle cold weather, so we like them to be earlier. There may be better options, but it's kind of the traditional seasons that we set when we first started youth seasons, and then we added the disabled hunters into that. So we can always look at better ways. I'm not saying that that's the way we need to do it, but that was some of the reasoning that came up when we first set these seasons up.
When did that first happen? What was the year?
About 2000.
Yeah, there is 200 times more corn planted, dry land corn planted in the western half of Kansas since then that there is today. And that's the big complaint is the change of all the dry land acres of corn nowadays in western Kansas. So.
Commissioner Sill, I appreciate wanting the kids to have the first chance at it. The heat does make a difference, as well as the crops, the changes in the deer behavior as well. Archers tend not to push deer around too much, even when they're out there a tremendous amount. Perhaps something to consider in the future is that after the muzzleloader season, give the deer a break for a week, and then maybe look at that time frame just prior to the whitetail antlerless weekend, something like that. I know the archers, I'm an archer too, may not be as thrilled about having youth out there during that week. But I think a lot of them would also realize that it might be worth it to be encouraging our young people, that they might be willing to share that space on the calendar and possibly increase the chance for the youth to be successful with a little bit cooler weather a little bit later in the season. I agree that it's something, while well-founded maybe in the beginning, maybe ought to be looked at and another option tried.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, this is Secretary Lovelace. Could I ask a question?
Hi, yes.
Thank you. Levi, what data, or anybody else wants to chip in, what data do we have in terms of surveys? And that's my first question. The second is in terms of numbers and participation from those two groups in that early season. What sense do we have? Numbers and then also feedback on preferences.
Levi, Jaster, Emporia. We can look at the number of youth permits that are sold. Current laws restrict us from actually contacting any youth under 16 for harvest survey type stuff, where we would normally ask preference type information. That's something we could look at. Otherwise, I could go back to older harvest surveys prior to that law being in effect, when we did send those hunters, those youth hunters, those surveys, and see, look at some of that. But that would probably be the ability to really look at that. We can also look through previous comments for the last few years and see if any of our survey respondents made comments about kids hunting, that kind of stuff, and try and piece how much of that we receive.
Good. That's helpful. Thanks. Complex, a lot of variables and a lot of preferences and things you're considering, obviously, by your description. So I like the idea of keeping this conversation going, just using our best information and making adjustments as we get new data. So I really appreciate all the feedback everybody's having. And certainly, as Commissioner Sporer mentioned, in Western Kansas, cropping has changed, timing has changed. And so always good for us to look at it with a fresh perspective. Thank you.
Another option could be a youth season split as well. So anyway, any other questions for Levi? All right. Levi, let's hold off on CWD for a little bit, and let's have some of these other presenters, and I'll let them come as kind of first one to start talking, unless, Jason, you have them in order. Are there three, two?
There's two. We have, I wasn't sure, Levi, who the name was for the Fire Stick.
Levi,
Okay.
that's John Zinnel from Federal Ammunition. I see he's on.
Yep, I see that. And then I saw Scott on, Steve Scott on the start with John and the Fire Stick. And then John, I'll share this, your part with everybody.
All right. Take it away, John.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and the Commission for the time today. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. John Zinnel with Federal Premium Ammunition. I'm their Conservation and Youth Shooting Sports Program Manager. I'm here today to talk to you about the Fire Stick system, which is a new muzzleloader ignition system that we brought to market the beginning of this year. And so we'll go to the next slide, please. Our engineers had been working on this for roughly 8 years before we finally were able to come to market. And that's kind of a standard timeline for when we're bringing new products to market. Things come and go and ebb and flow as the market trends change. And so it's something that we saw as a want and a need based on consumers. And so we took the time to build a great system and took a lot of time to research a lot of the muzzleloading history and so forth. And some of the inconsistencies and complexities that are there and barriers that are somewhat set forth for bringing new folks into the field when it comes to muzzleloader hunting. And so when I work with the R3 programs with state agencies and NGOs across the country, the muzzleloader season is a great opportunity for big game hunting and taking those kids out. A lot of times the seasons are multiple weekends and opportunities to hit the field with less folks, which make it a less intimidating opportunity for those youth or new time hunters to come. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So the Fire Stick system is a unique breech system. So this polymer case is loaded, manufactured in our facility in Anoka, Minnesota. It's completely encapsulated. Hopefully you can see on my video, if you're not watching the screen, I do have one here in my hands as well. So these are, like I said, manufactured here in Minnesota. We use Hodgdon 888 powder, which obviously is a Kansas company. So we proudly partnered with them, as well as Traditions Firearms on the firearms, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So it does have a breakable front plastic that actually will hold all that powder into there. So this comes unprimed. So the folks that are purchasing these in the stores will be buying these capsules and they'll be inserting their own primers into them. So they're not they're shipped differently than a normal ammunition would be. So the system is built to be loaded through the breech, like I mentioned, with the propellant only. The projectile, as you can see in that photo, is still loaded through the muzzle, and I'll go through that on the next slide, please. So you can see this photo here on the presentation is showing you looking through from breech to muzzle on a open muzzle loader. I do have one here that I can show you how that is. There's a constrictor ring that's built into the barrel. So 100% has to be loaded with the projectile through the muzzle. There's no possible way to load a projectile through the breech. The only thing that's happening at the breech is this charging capsule that would be then entered in through the breech. Whereas some muzzleloaders in the market today, there's some quick removable breech plugs and things where you can take a quarter turn and you can actually load 100% your projectile, your propellant through the breech, whereas this is not the case. So there's lots of benefits to this, a lot of which I talk a lot on the R3 side with new hunters, new shooters, is it's safe. There's easy removal in the field if you're crossing a fence or going in and out of stands. The consistency of the load, because it's loaded in our manufacturing facility, is similar to what our ammunition would be as far as our tight tolerances. It eliminates that risk and the challenges of undercharging or overcharging your muzzleloader, which can sometimes be intimidating to new folks. It's impervious to moisture, so it can store for years. You don't have to worry about the humidity changing your powder as far as any of your burn rates and so forth if you're really trying to dial it in. And there's several different preloaded charges that'll be available. So next slide, please. So this goes through the loading, and a lot of the questions that I've had as I've worked with other state agencies on updating and clarifying regulations is how does it actually work? And so to go through it really quickly, obviously your safety's on. You load your projectile through the muzzle with a ramrod. Then you would open up that muzzle loader at the breech. It's a hinge action similar to an over-under type shotgun. You would hinge that action open. You would insert your fire stick capsule. Then you would put your primer, 209, standard 209 primer into the capsule, close the muzzle loader, hammer back, safety off, pull the trigger, and so forth. And so that's the basic loading. So you're absolutely still using a ramrod and still loading through the muzzle. Next slide, please. So here's some basic, just some cutaways and some things that you can see there. You can see the restrictor ring that's through the muzzle. And I have one here if you can see my photo as you're going through there. So it is a hinge action, very easy to open up. And the other one is when you're in the field, whether you're getting in and out of your car and so forth, is very easy opportunity to see whether or not it's loaded or not. So there's a flashlight through the barrel. Obviously, if it's loaded and there's a projectile in there, you would not be able to see through the barrel if you're opening it up, looking at it just like you would in an over-under shotgun. So that gives you a great safety aspect to it, to where you can focus on making sure that that things are handled in the correct way. Next slide, please. So here I broke down, obviously we're here in Minnesota. I've been working with the Minnesota DNR. So I kept this on here as an example I've been working on since prior to even the North American Wildlife Conference. Worked with the DNR. They were at a place where they really wanted to update their muzzleloader regulations as written anyway, as well as there was an amendment for an unloaded firearm definition that they wanted to have updated. So we worked with the DNR on language, got it placed with some co-authors on both the House and the Senate. And working its way through the legislative process. And obviously with the challenges of COVID and several other things going on here in Minnesota, the legislator has not taken action to vote on any of their environmental bills. So odds are with this change for Minnesota, we're looking at a 2021 change. But we do have several other states that we've worked on that have confirmed the use for the 2020 hunting seasons coming up this fall. So this is just a kind of an overview of what their regulation was coming into 2019, and then what we did as far as a language change to that. Next slide. And so here's how they'll come as far as packages go for this immediate launch that we did in January at SHOT Show. There was two various load charges. So there's a 100 grain load charge, which is this orange color, and there's a red colored capsule, which you could see very similar in the presentation there. That's 120 grains. So we do have the ability to work on some additional charges. I think we are working on for this next year an 80 grain and then also a 150. So we're going to go one on the lighter side and one on a little of the heavier side. But these were the first two that are starting to hit the markets for this fall. Our first shipments have already started to go out. And this is a partnership with, like I said, Federal Premium. We have the fire stick and the actual system, and we worked with Hodgdon Powder. So it's a 888 powder that is loaded into the capsules. And then Traditions are making the firearms. So the only firearm that's capable of shooting this system is their Nitro Fire, which is the one I just was using as a demonstration. And they're already starting to ship products as well through their consumer bases. And then coming into next year, when we talk 2021, there's the potential for other manufacturers then to start to manufacture firearms and muzzleloaders to utilize this system. I believe that was my last slide. I talked fast, but I know you guys have a very busy agenda, so I didn't want to take up a pile of your time, but more than happy to answer any specific questions that somebody may have.
Gerald Lauber here. Is what states currently allow the use of the fire stick technology?
So we have about a dozen states. So Montana, Wyoming, they don't have muzzleloader specific seasons, so we did count them into there. South Dakota, Iowa, Oklahoma, Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, Alabama, Georgia, Vermont, New York, New Jersey, and I believe Maryland was the last one that we were able to get. So I oftentimes highlight Ohio as a state. They were one that had a very restrictive muzzleloader definition that had to have a threaded breech plug in place for big game hunting. And they went through the process on their own this year and changed through their legislative process to remove that and to open this up for use. And with that, just to, I guess, elaborate one more time, we have about a dozen more states that we're working through the process for 2021. But as you guys know, sitting on the commission, there's a timeline in place that is into play when it comes to making any of these regulation changes. So we have about another dozen on the hook for 2021 as far as just going through that process to answer questions and have conversations within their commission and public forum.
Okay, are there any other questions for John?
Commissioner Spohr, what's the range on this firearm?
So it doesn't affect the range or change anything as far as enhancements for the actual system. It goes, what you'll see is you'll see an increased accuracy because of the consistency of the powder there, because it's measured in our facility on machines that are far more capable than a normal powder horn would be or a pelletized powder would be. So as far as the range goes, you're shooting the exact same sabos or bullets that you would otherwise. So you'll see the same performance as far as yardage. There's no enhancement on that side.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions for John, Mr. Zennel?
Well, I thank you for your time and look forward to answering any follow-up questions after the meeting and into any others in the future.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I happen to see this technology advertised or written about in my American Hunter that arrived a couple days ago. And I can see the advantages. I can see there will be two sides of the issue, and I just kind of know how that works. So I don't know exactly what our next step is, but I appreciate you educating us.
You bet. Thank you for the time.
All right. Levi, do you have any comments on this? Okay, well, if not, Steve, are you the next person?
Mr. Chairman, before we
Yeah.
move forward, we do have Nadia Reimer, Chief of Public Affairs. We do have a comment from the public. If you just have a moment, I'll go ahead and just read it off. It was in the chat room.
That'll be just fine.
Okay, so this is from Greg. He says, first off, I work in product manufacturing and sales and love innovation from Federal. This, though, serves as a perfect example of innovation that gives the hunter an additional edge and puts the game at a disadvantage. Last message, just please remember that big deer aren't an unlimited resource. Thanks again for your time.
Okay. Thanks for that comment. Any others? Jason, Nadia?
It doesn't look like it at this point.
All right, well, then let's go on. Steve, you want to talk to us now?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and I'll speak briefly in support of using air guns as a legal means of take for big game. I am the host of a television series called Safari Hunters Journal. I've hunted in Africa and around the world extensively. And over the last couple of years, I've used a product from Umarex called the Hammer. It's a 50 caliber PCP air rifle. And I've taken a fair amount of fairly large game to demonstrate the efficacy. This 50 caliber rifle shoots a projectile anywhere between 550 grains, different levels of hardness of the bullet. So it can take anything from a dangerous game like this Cape buffalo, certainly white-tailed deer and coyotes and things like that. This is now in factory production. It's relatively inexpensive. And the reason I'm here today to speak about this, I want to prove to you that this is an ethical weapon to harvest game in the United States. Specifically, we're discussing Kansas, obviously. But more importantly, this is a tool that can be used by people that may not normally be hunters, or it may keep people in the hunting game selling more hunting licenses down the road. Because this is not a firearm. This is an air rifle. It's very powerful, but there's not the fire and the gunpowder and the type of explosion that occurs with a traditional center fire rifle or black powder rifle. And this gun is in production and can be used effectively. And if you wouldn't mind, Jason, showing a demonstration of the efficacy of this firearm. This is an eland. It's the largest antelope in Africa. This is another Cape buffalo I harvested. This is actually the first Cape buffalo. And the last animal I'm going to show you, and there's a specific reason for it. Well, second to last, this was the first large animal we harvested, which is obviously a bison. And the last one is an Asian water buffalo. Now, this thing is a little larger than a Cape buffalo, a little over 2,000 pounds. And I just want to tell you quickly what happened. I had this at a range of about 35 yards, and I shot it in the right shoulder, but when it ran off, it was limping on the left shoulder. And you'll see why here in the next two slides. This bullet transected the chest cavity. And this was a very hard bullet. It had a Brinell of about 24, but it still deflected because it hit the humerus bone on the off side of the animal, and this was the result. Next slide, please. This is the humerus bone that was broken into two pieces. This is the off shoulder. So I show this, and thank you for that, Jason. I show this just as a demonstration of the efficacy of this firearm. It's of somewhat limited range. It's not going to get out much more than 125 or 150 yards tops. So it's very similar to a black powder rifle in that respect. But it is something that in a lot of ways is like a bow or a crossbow, because typically the range is going to be less than 100 yards. And this is just another tool that we can bring other hunters into the game that is safe, doesn't have some of the negatives of a firearm, and can be used by people that may not have been hunters before. And that's all, unless there's questions.
All right. Any questions for Steve?
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
This is Brad Lovelace from Topeka. So my question is, understand the discussion about potential recruitment of new hunters who didn't want to use a firearm previously. Based on your data, what fraction of your air gun owners are new hunters? I know some, but they are all experienced hunters who have lots of other firearms, and it's just kind of a new thing to try. What percentage are people that use air guns exclusively and have essentially taken up hunting as a result of being able to use an air gun?
At this time, there would be very few, because the people that have been doing big game air gun hunting are, they create their own weapons. There's been a small group of people that have been doing this for years, This is the first factory rifle that can do that. And frankly, it's only been in distribution over the last 3 months. And the orders for it, the back orders, it'll take several months to clear the back orders. So I imagine most people that are on that list right now are experienced hunters. I think what I'm referring to, and it's speculative, but down the road there will be, this will be an option. But you know, right now this is something that I think a lot of hunters that maybe don't have the same thrill they had before when they were hunting. This is something that brings an element of uncertainty, of limitation to it. Actually, you have to be a better hunter to be able to harvest something with an air gun than something that you can shoot 800-900 yards.
Okay, thank you.
This is Gerald. First of all, with 250, 300 grain bullet, what's the muzzle velocity?
I can tell you with 350 grains, 300 is legal for dangerous game in Africa in most countries. We used a 350 grain buffalo bullet with a Brunel of 24, I believe, and the velocity that we would get would be fairly consistently 946 feet per second. It's big and it's slow, but obviously it has enough terminal energy to do the damage that needs to be done to make an ethical kill. Smaller bullet, it'll go a little faster, obviously.
And these are single shot rifles?
Actually, the Hammer has a 2-round magazine. The maximum pressure in the onboard tank is 4,500 feet per second. It takes 3,000 pounds for a full power shot. So with a 4,500 pounds of pressure, you can have a second shot that would occur almost as fast as a center fire rifle. It's a little bit slower process because it's the magazine moves as opposed to the bullet being inserted. So it's just slightly slower, but you can get a second shot, and there's still enough left after that to load a new magazine without recharging for a coup de grace, for a final shot to put the animal down if need be.
Well, that's what I'm trying to come up with. When I go with a center fire, I usually carry a pocket full of shells and hope they only shoot once.
Exactly.
Sometimes an errant shot requires a continued effort to try to finish off the animal. And I wanted to, there's an issue of if you had to have 3 or 4 shots, it's going to be a little tougher. That's no different than, I suppose, a hunter using a single shot weapon and not bringing enough ammunition with him. I don't see whether that's anything. I have shot one of these in a controlled environment, and it's my opinion that they are different than what I had used to, what I had normally determined was an air rifle. I have not had constituents screaming that they must have these. I also have one question, but it may or may not make any difference, but are these now covered by the Pittman-Robinson Act as far as an excise tax?
I can't speak directly to the details of this, but that was a concern that several people in the industry expressed, and Umarex has negotiated a fee, effectively a Pittman-Robertson payment. So this rifle is paying its way as every other rifle is.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Mr. Scott from the commission? Gerald again. I don't know where we go with this. I suppose I'm going to ask staff to sort of review the meeting today and see whether they can come up with a good reason to include it or not. Other than the fact that it's kind of a novelty and a challenge, it doesn't answer any problems that current center fires don't already provide. But I'm not particularly for or against. So why don't we try to have staff kind of look at this and we'll go from there. Is there another person in the audience who wants to speak on this item? Nadia or Jason, have you received any hands up emails or texts?
Levi Jaster just raised his hands, but I have not seen anybody else from the public.
All right, Levi, what do you have to say?
Levi Jaster, Emporia. I just wanted to know what the cost is to be set up with this. What does it take to get for entry?
The retail, this is Steve Scott. The retail on this rifle is about $800. The street price is going to be a little less than that. And it comes down to then where do you get the air? You can, and Umarex has created a portable pumping device that I actually don't know what the price is because they haven't introduced it yet. But what I do when I go to the range, I bought a scuba bottle and it's easily filled. Virtually everybody has access within a reasonable amount of distance, a scuba shop that can fill a tank, and I could put 3,200 pounds of pressure in the gun almost, for in perpetuity, and be able to do it that way. And Commissioner, you brought up the multiple shots, and that certainly is a consideration. When I hunt, I have what we call a buddy bottle, a small carbon fiber tank that would allow for pressure for an additional 5 or 6 shots. So that kind of solves the problem of are you going to be able to ethically harvest an animal if you don't make a perfect shot? And in answer to the question with regard to the total cost, between the bullets and the air, you could really get into this completely loaded for between $1,200 and $1,500. And the area that I see this being taken up from, aside from people that are experienced hunters and want a new challenge, especially in the East Coast. I'm in Oklahoma, this doesn't apply to us as much, but in a lot of places in the country, white-tailed deer are so overpopulated that they need to be controlled. And in these suburban type of settings, you can't do that with a rifle. Sometimes there's an opposition in cities to archery products because sometimes they're not as, some shots aren't as good as they should be, and the result of that can be negative. This takes that element of variability out. It's a low impact weapon that could be used for culling purposes, for these kind of special hunts. And I imagine that will become prevalent more on the eastern side of the country than it does here in the central. But there are this is definitely a niche item, but there are places that I think this could be put to good use. And I'll tell you this, just from personal experience, it's fun. It's really a lot of fun.
Okay, this is Gerald again. It's not that it makes any difference, but how many states currently allow this type of weapon to be used for big game?
I don't know that number exactly, but I think it's maybe 21. I know Arkansas is, I know Texas is. I did a podcast with a gentleman yesterday that told me that Maine had approved it, but I wish I had that information, but I think it's 20 or 21.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Steve or for Levi on this topic?
This is Commissioner Spore. Levi, the fire stick that federal's talking about, is that legal in Kansas today? If not, why not?
Levi, Jaster, Emporia, I think that would be a better question for Chris Tymeson than myself.
Mr. Chairman, Chris Tymeson, Commissioner Spore. 115-4-4 is the big game legal equipment regulation. And both of these proposals would have to modify that regulation. The first one related to the fire stick requires that separate components be loaded through the muzzle of the barrel. We would have to change that portion of the regulation to say that the projectile would have to be loaded through the muzzle in order to authorize the fire stick. In the case of Mr. Scott's proposal, we'd have to come up with a definition of a big game rifle again, and then decide in what season it would be able to be used.
Thank you.
And Mr. Chair?
Yes.
This is Brad Lovelace from Topeka. We'll be glad to review both of those items and with staff, and then report back at our next commission meeting about the staff discussion around those.
I think that would be Gerald here. For my purposes, I think that'd be fine. Any other commissioners have any other instruction or recommendation that they would like to put forth?
I have one question for Mr. Zinnel. What happens if you load your bullet first and then you load the fire stick through the breech and there's a gap between those? Is that not a safety issue? How do you prevent having a gap between the bullet and your powder, your fire stick?
John Zinnel here again with Federal. So there's a shelf that is built into the inside of the barrel, and because of the way that the 888 powder burns inside of the capsule, you don't get the crud ring. For any muzzleloaders out there have heard of the crud ring after you shoot 1 or 2 or 3, you don't get that same type of crud ring that you would receive here. So you're able to seat that bullet on the shelf consistently every time. I've taken these out and shot them here at my range going through stress tests, and I've shot 20 to 30 ones without cleaning, and it still seats tight against that shelf. And the shelf is built to give you the specific gap between the capsule and the actual projectile to go. And one other safety aspect that kind of goes along with this is at the end of the season, or even at the end of the day, if you wanted to, you open the muzzleloader up, and you use your ramrod, and you can push from breech to muzzle, and you can push that projectile back out the other end very easily. And then without having that traditional breech plug that you would have to thread out, this having the ring instead, you can actually clean right through that, as you saw with the flashlight through the actual barrel.
Commissioner Silt, so the fire stick really is unique to a specific gun. You can't just use it in any inline muzzle loader then?
That is correct. It has to use a fire stick compatible muzzle loader, which Traditions is the only company as of right now. They had a 1-year exclusive with us as we went through the 8 years worth of designing. And then after into 2021, it'll be open for other manufacturers to open. And so Traditions right now has price point muzzleloaders anywhere from the $400 range to the $1,200 range, multiple different models within that nitro fire. So it kind of fits within any budget of folks that are really looking at whether they want a full combo or things. But in 2021, I would imagine that you'll see other manufacturers building fire stick systems.
Commissioner Sill, thank you for the explanation. That helps clarify it for me. Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Okay, then Levi, will you move on to CWD?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Levi, Jaster, and Emporia. This will be pretty brief, but Jason, could you pull that map up for me, please? But I am pleased to announce that the department will be starting a research project for chronic wasting disease. We need to get some data at a finer scale than we have in the past, and we want to tie that to deer habitat specifically, and look at how chronic wasting disease is going to move across areas through different habitats, and just be able to have that to focus our sampling efforts better to detect it earlier, which would give us more options management wise. Also a chance to, let hunters know sooner that it has come into an area. And then we're also going to do some different types of mapping, some of the risk mapping to, potentially we'll be able to predict, what happens if we have a new spot pop up in an area we've not found it before. So this is rather timely in recent events in Kansas where we've had a captive cervid facility test positive in eastern Kansas now. And so our sampling is going to occur by deer management units. And it will be, so in this coming season, so the 2020 to 2021 season, we're going to be sampling in those blue units. So deer management units 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. This project is also going to allow us to provide sampling to hunters that will be paid for by the project across more area than we normally would through our regular rotation. Our normal sampling area zone this year is going to be most of units 3, 4, 7, and 8 in the North Central. And also with that captive facility testing positive, because we're already planning to sample in the eastern part of Kansas, we'll be able to really put some focus into that area where that facility was, and hopefully, see what's going on with our wild deer herd in that area. So this will be, over 3 years. Next year we'll be in that green section down in south central, southwest Kansas. And then our regular sampling monitoring efforts will be in eastern Kansas. So we'll have a couple consecutive years. And then the third year of this project will be in that northwest, north central area to do this. So just a chance. We want, we hope hunters will participate and get samples for us through their hunter harvested animals. We plan to utilize our normal methods to collect samples, such as taxidermists and potentially processors that work with us. And we may supplement with roadkills to try and bolster numbers, especially in areas we're not getting as many samples as we need for the statistics related to this. But I just wanted to let everybody know that's getting ready to start this fall. Thanks to Nadia and her crew in public affairs. We've got a page for this into the fall hunting regulations, I believe. So just to let everybody know this is coming up, and we'll have more news as we go forward with it.
Mr. Chairman, this is Emmerich. I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
Levi, how will this be reported back out? How and when?
So Levi, Jaster, Emporia. So we will have, as we proceed through this, we will have those prevalence rates for the counties, or sorry, not counties, for the deer management units, maybe some counties if we get enough samples out of a county. And then, so I will be able to share that. And then it will also, we'll be able to put together some reports to provide the maps to everyone. And there's also some money in the project for educational materials, publications type stuff. So we'll be providing some of those to folks.
Any other questions for Levi?
This is
Yeah.
Commissioner.
Warren, go ahead.
Yeah, Warren Gefeller. Levi, where are most of the cases we've seen to this point? Which of these colored areas are being the bulk of the cases?
So Levi, Jasper, Emporia, the bulk of the cases in Kansas have been in units 1, 2, and 3, mostly because that's where we've had chronic wasting disease the longest that we know of in Kansas. That was,
just curiosity. I don't know that it matters, but is there any reason why we didn't start the sampling in that area as opposed to eastern Kansas?
So Levi, Jasper, Emporia, we have actually just, so this year we're sampling in that north central. We sampled up in the northwest the year prior to that. And this rotation allowed us to do the sampling for this project without interfering with our current monitoring efforts, as far as overlapping units at the same time. And in this case, it's not necessarily, doesn't really matter as much that we're not getting, the same areas each year, because we want to get a good number across the state in each unit. And with that, we're going to definitely hit that area hard for sure. But we also, my hope is that if we are unfortunate enough to have some areas we have yet to detect chronic wasting disease in, because we do have certainly areas where we don't get a high density of samples from, I'm hopeful that we will, this effort will help us pick it up. And so being able to do it all around the state is important. But the big reason was that it did not interfere with our current monitoring efforts. So that way we can maintain the data from those to keep those trends rolling through, for consistency and not throw too many questions on that.
All right, thanks. That makes sense. Thank you.
Any other questions for Levi?
Commissioner Spohr. Levi, you mentioned cost sharing with the testing with the hunters. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Levi, Jasper, Emporia. Yeah. So in this case, the hunter only has to submit the sample to us for this effort, or to the, we'll actually have some technicians out, hopefully being able to contact some hunters in the field also to collect samples on their own from roadkills and such, or pick them up from taxidermists to get them to go to processing. And so in those cases, a hunter provides the sample for us along with the information we need, and we will pay for it entirely. So basically the hunter doesn't have to pay for the sample. And so, and then if we haven't worked out how we're going to notify everyone, or if we can even, because the number of samples we'd like is 450 samples per deer management unit. And so that's basically, somebody full-time on the phone letting people know results. But we will absolutely let them know if they want us to let them know. Also, we won't bother them if they're just like, here's the sample and I don't want to hear back from you again about it. But we will let them know if it's positive. Absolutely. We'll let them know that, provided they give us their information to contact them again.
Commissioner Spohr, where will they pick up the sample kits at? How will they get their hands on an actual sample kit?
They can get them through some of our staff. They also don't necessarily need a sample kit. They can basically, the same knife that they would use to dress their deer, cut out the samples and toss them in a Ziploc bag. And if it's the same day, that's, great. Otherwise, they can just be refrigerated. So they don't even need to get a kit to get a sample to us. We just need the lymph nodes and the, and some data from them.
How are you going to get, this is Commissioner Spore, how are you going to get this information to the deer hunters?
So Levi, Jasper, Emporia. So like I said, we've got a page in our regulation summary for this fall. And I'm also working with Nadia in the public affairs shop to develop some messages to be able to announce to hunters. If you're talking about how we would connect with them if we have a positive sample from them, then that would likely be either a phone call or we'll send them an email, depending on whatever contact information they've provided to us for that purpose.
This is Commissioner Spore. Thank you, Levi.
Commissioner Spore, I might just go ahead and add a little bit of detail if you don't mind.
Sure.
Nadia Reimer, Public Affairs. Just to mirror what Levi shared and add a little bit, we will supplement that with some traditional news media as well as social media. And then our agency is also going to be establishing a website. It's called a microsite. So it's going to be a condensed version of our current website, but the content will be specific to deer hunting in Kansas and CWD. And that will be heavily promoted through a promotional campaign that we're building right now. So we will encourage deer hunters over the next 3 years to go to that website as well as our agency website to access this information.
Commissioner Lauber, is there any additional questions for Levi or anything on this?
This is Commissioner Spore. So Levi, basically, they don't even need a test kit. They just need instructions on how to obtain the sample and directions on where to send it. Is that correct?
Levi, Jasper, Emporia. Yes, that's correct. And in some cases, we may be able to arrange drop off and pick up at certain areas. So we're kind of evaluating that, and we're going to depend on our field staff to help us identify potential areas to do some of that kind of, or implement those kind of options.
2 questions. This is Commissioner Spore. 2 questions. Is this going to be, this type of testing and sampling going to be available statewide or only in the eastern half? And also the question, this sampling isn't something that can be mailed.
Levi, Jasper, Emporia. So this sampling will be occurring in those different colored zones over the next 3 years. So this coming season is the blue, will be in the green the season after that. So, and then in 2 years, we'll be up in that brown orangey color. Samples in the test kit bottles or vials can be mailed. And we're looking at what we can do to provide some of that ahead of time too. In those cases, I'd have to go back and check with the researcher we're working with to do this about whether or not we're including postage in that project. If it's posted, it may be that would have to be paid for by the hunter that's mailing it. In most cases, though, I think we could arrange somehow to work with one of our staff to get samples so they don't have to mail them. They'll either have to deal with that.
Okay. Any other questions for Levi? I have a couple, but is there any other questions? All right. Being from the eastern part of the state, I sort of had a good feeling that CWD, while it may travel at 55 miles an hour, was primarily located in the western part of the state, north central part. And that little bubble of tranquility was busted up when a captive cervid was found in Osage County, which is the next county south of Topeka. A little history. At one point in time, Wildlife and Parks, and it may have been under the name Fish and Game back then, was charged with the task of monitoring and supervising captive game farms, captive cervids, captive deer farms. And to our credit, but to the dissatisfaction of some, we actually tried to provide a supervisory function and the responsibility of monitoring those captive deer herds were taken from us legislatively, and they were given to the Livestock Commission. And so, well, I would like to think that the Livestock Commission spends a lot of time with great concern monitoring the health and status of their captive cervids. I'm not sure that is a well-placed thought. And what I'm going to say is that I think this is really serious. There is a known association between CWD and captive deer herds. Some of these are sort of like animals stuck in a feedlot. You have unnatural grouping. The one advantage is you can sort of watch them wither away and die, and so they die out in the dirt rather than die in the woods. I would like for somebody, and it may fall because I don't want to get crosswise with the Livestock Commission, and I think they do a good job at what they are most trained to do, but it may be forced upon Secretary Lovelace and some of his staff members to find out just what they do to prevent chronic wasting disease. What kind of testing do they have? Wild deer can get in some of these areas, high fence or not. And I would like to know what they have to offer and what they're doing. And if it becomes something that is of concern, I think we should let the sportsmen know just exactly what's going on out there, because we may find that there is inadequate supervision. And if there is, we're going to have a problem in the wild herds eventually. That's in part why Levi is starting on the eastern part of the state, an area which traditionally hasn't had any CWD. Now, Secretary Lovelace, do you understand kind of what I'm concerned about? And do you have any comments?
Yep. Brad Lovelace, Topeka. I do understand that. I know in my time here in the last year and a half, we've had 2 meetings with a lot of people, including the Secretary of Agriculture, Bean, to have these kind of discussions so we can collaborate more effectively with them. I will tell you that our staff has had a long-term relationship, a very collegial relationship with Department of Ag. We don't have a lot of authority over this program, but we do have a good working relationship. So that's I think a good basis for us to continue, working with them. We will be glad to report back to you. Essentially, your question is the same question I had of our staff. What is our role versus Department of Ag's role, and where, and I wanted to have that characterized for me. We can do that same thing for the commission. And I think that's a great question. How how do these regulations work? And how comfortable are you with those? That's the same question as we talk about with staff, periodically. So we would be glad to summarize that for you, how the program works right now, what the level of oversight is, and the requirements based on current regulations for those captive served operations. And we can summarize that for you, and we'll be glad to report back to you.
Well, I think that's Gerald here. I think that's a good idea. I mean, Mike Beam's a good guy, and he does a good job. I'm not sure that an elk herd and high fence is an area to which he has a lot of experience. He will try his best, but I just don't know whether that's the direction that I just don't know how effective it is. So I would like to have you do precisely that, report back to us. And I want the sportsmen to realize, because we may find that their input's necessary to help make modifications. So that's all I have. Is there any other questions on this particular portion of the discussion from any of the people on any of the commissioners or the public?
Commissioner Sill, is the tentative plan then to maintain our status quo through the end of the research and looking at any of the regulations that we might do to mitigate the CWD, or is there still looking at making some regs temporarily at least and then modifying them with new data as you develop it?
Levi, Jaster, Emporia. Right now, there is not a decision to maintain status quo. If we have an opportunity to address this before the end of this project, I think we certainly should. And I don't think that an effort like that would really impact the project's effort either. So no, I think as we have a need to address things and can do so, we should do that. But we'll, certainly, be doing our normal evaluation processes to make sure that we do what needs to be done in the proper way.
Commissioner Sill, thanks, Levi. I was a little concerned that we might be putting things off for 3 years, so that was good news. Thank you.
Commissioner Lauber, a lot of the issue may come, and after the secretary and his staff reports back to the level of supervision, we may feel better, we may have a queasy stomach. In those regards, there's not a lot we can do, but I think the more facts we know now and the sooner we know them, the better. And I agree with that. We don't need to wait 3 years to decide what to do. If we start seeing a trend, we need to respond. Any other questions?
This is Commissioner Spohr. I'm not sure if this question is for Levi or Secretary Lovelace, but the concern that I'm hearing about is once a deer is harvested, hunters want to know, is the meat contaminated or not? Is it good for consumption? And my question is on a statewide level, could the department handle some type of testing available to everybody that harvested a deer? Is that even possible?
So Levi,
yeah,
Levi, Jaster, Emporia, that has been in our discussions for the last couple of years. How can we address that? Because that is certainly a concern. In previous years, we had taken to addressing chronic wasting disease as a herd health issue and less so a human health issue. But we also never tell people to eat a sick animal. Always, even if it's questionable, to dispose of it and don't risk it. And so it has been a growing human health concern. And I can tell you that that is not just a Kansas concern either. That's across the states. Many of my colleagues in other states are now focusing on what we can do also. Right now, it would be, addressing potential funding to that in the amount that would be required for the entire deer herd, because that would be a about 80,000 deer at $28 a head for per sample. And so making sure we can reliably provide that to hunters once we implement it, discussing how to do that. Is it, and then also getting that information back to hunters, because we don't want to violate any privacy issues, and giving that information back to them. But for that many deer, there's no way we could call or even hardly email each and every hunter. Email might be more possible if we could do sort of an automated type setup, but we also have to work with our diagnostic lab at K-State, how we would, transfer some of that, because we both have differing rules as far as privacy and that kind of stuff. And so how to make things work with them. So there's a lot that goes into that, but we've certainly been discussing what we can do in those cases.
Mr. Lauber, in part of an answer to the question that Commissioner Spohr has and a lot of other people, there isn't a good way to accomplish what you'd like to have accomplished. It takes too long to get the test results back, and there just isn't a good way to satisfy the public's desire to know and cover all the deer that get harvested. I just don't see how we can do it.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Brad Lovelace from Topeka. Yeah, we certainly agree with your sentiments about it being desirable. So our first steps are to educate. That's why Nadia is working with our technical staff to come up with a good way to educate and inform the public. Then, we obviously, as Levi described, target certain areas, based on our research needs. At the same time, part of the education is equipping sportsmen and women with information so that they can act on their own if they choose, and develop those pathways. So for instance, if you shoot a deer out by Oakley, how to sample. We've got that video out there, how to take your own sample, and information on how to get it to the right place. Now that cost is a little daunting. A lot of people, wouldn't be interested in paying it. $28 a lot. So we're working to do two things. If we educate people that basically the appropriate steps are harvest your animal, take care of it in a certain way in terms of quartering it. If you need to transport it, here's how you do that. Here's how you take that sample and submit it. Wait till you get the results of those samples, and just educate them about that. But we'd like to speed up the pace at which samples can be processed and a sportsman can get the results. And then secondly, to reduce the cost of that. And part of that might be, us underwriting those samples. Maybe we can't pay the whole $28. Maybe we can reduce it down, by half, to make it more desirable for people to use it on a widespread basis. So those are all the questions we're asking. The first step is to educate, make sure sportsmen are aware of this threat, what they can do to help it and respond, personally and corporately. And then we're also trying to deal with the cost, how we can help defray these costs and get more people involved, because that also becomes valuable data for us. We really, that's what will help us make better decisions, is more widespread data, increase the number of samples is really important to us. So we're working on all those fronts, but the first step, educating so people know what we're up against.
Any other questions before we move on?
Commissioner Spore, is there a private testing company out there that would be capable of handling this type of mass testing, where the department would just pass the cost on for the sampling through the licensing methods? So if somebody chose to buy a permit, they could click on a box to receive a sample kit that was provided and tested by a private company other than the department. Is there such companies out there that would be capable of that type of testing?
Levi Jaster Emporia. Currently, I'm not aware of any specifically private companies that do so. There may be some that have been started to do so, but so far, most of those are at either different state or federal entities, or mostly they are through labs at universities. They may be, slightly separate. The veterinary diagnostics lab at K-State is, associated with Kansas State University, who we normally use. But as of right now, I'm not aware of any private company that has started doing this on any kind of a large scale anyways. I do know that there are a couple of research projects going on right now that are trying to get a field test made to where, a hunter harvests a deer and right there in the field can test the animal. Those efforts started, a couple of years ago, and I don't know how those have progressed yet. But that is being worked on, and hopefully it comes sooner rather than later.
This is Commissioner Spore. Thank you, Levi. I appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, Mike Miller, Assistant Secretary Pratt. I had a question for Levi. I know Levi's been in conversation with his colleagues in other states, and there are states that have dealt with this a lot longer than we have. Are they doing testing in a different way, say in Colorado or Wyoming, or are they fighting the same battles we are?
Levi Jaster Emporia. Every state has had to kind of adapt it to their own system. There are quite a few similarities, such as Colorado or Wyoming, on how they sample, basically rotating through different units each year. Some of that depends too on whether they're focused on monitoring populations that already have chronic wasting disease, or whether they're doing surveillance, trying to detect it in new areas potentially, and how they achieve those. But most of it's through the same, a specific area each year that they cover. How they've covered the testing is usually very similar to ours, where if you're being in a zone that's being specifically tested for the year, the department usually would pay for it there. Outside of that, some states have low enough sample submission overall that they just cover them. Some states, the hunter has to pay the fee to have the testing done. But yeah, it's been, the only other real difference in some states, I think, is that in a lot of, like Colorado does, when they're testing a specific unit, those units are under mandatory sampling requirements. And so hunters have to, by regulation, have those animals tested for chronic wasting disease if they're harvested in that unit, versus ours is still all voluntary.
Any other questions for Levi? Well, thank you. That's been a good report. let's move on to the next item, the role of controlled shooting areas. Keith?
Okay, this is Keith Houghton from North Central Kansas, Southwest Mitchell County, in the little town of Tipton. Some of you, I sent a message to of apology for an invitation that you hadn't even gotten yet. We were hedging on this meeting, and we had hoped to be able to bring the commissioners in and have a little educational and experience and also informal opportunity to talk to these controlled shooting areas. If you draw about a 50-mile circle around the town of Tipton, we've had a pretty good proliferation of these type operations, and they have blossomed in the last couple decades, and it is becoming a significant significant part of the puzzle. We consider that the controlled shooting areas complements what the state does in trying to provide opportunities. And those of us who grew up in the 80s and had the opportunity to participate in those unbelievable bird hunts when the CRP program came in, that's a difficult thing to do today. But we had hoped to be able to, we did not know. I know of a couple of the commissioners that have had some exposure to the controlled shooting areas, but I don't know how many people have beyond that. And it was our interest to try to provide some background on what's kind of evolved in that part of the industry. And so we can join forces and move ahead. A lot of things like the tourism issue it's a pretty substantial piece of the puzzle for the state of Kansas. Kansas controlled shooting areas don't have to be like your father's suburban hunting preserve was, and we have to overcome a stigma, a negative stigma. And I'll hit on one topic several times. The issue of quality game birds in appearance and performance is the issue, and providing good habitat. That seems to be key roles. I've been part of the board of the North American Game Bird Association, and we have a real push on to do everything we can to be able to have our producers putting birds out there that look, act, and perform like our native bird populations do. Our operation is a hunting facility that we initiated 38 years ago, and I will admit that we were very fortunate to have survived the startup learning curve. There wasn't a lot of assistance in what needs to be done and how to do it, but we were fortunate enough to. Most of us my age that experienced those hunts in the 80s don't think we are interested in a bird hunt, but it's a big part of the puzzle for our folks from out of state, our non-residents who come to hunt, and we can put on a good show for that. In our particular operation, we have individuals that have been coming back to our operation in excess of 30 years, and that's turned into 3-generation hunting parties typically. They have not missed a season for over 30 years. The development of our CSA and those that are of recent vintage, and our state association, the Kansas Sport Hunting Association, has been very active in putting on seminars, not in the last couple of years, but people who are interested in initiating the business in passing on those things that work for us and are successful, and have been a very, very good thing for us to convey all that. Our canceled event due to the meeting being held like this, we have tentatively with Sheila postponed that event till our April commission meeting, and we sure aren't going to have the aesthetics that we've got here now. We have the most wonderful cover that we have seen for several years, just due to the luxurious winds, rains. That kind of summarizes what, but I think it could be very productive for us to have formal and informal opportunity to discuss how these controlled shooting areas fit into the scheme of things.
Gerald here. Is there any questions for Keith?
Mr. Chair, I might just make a comment. Keith, I think everybody's disappointed that we couldn't come out to see you. We really appreciate your generous invitation. And I think I'm the most disappointed of all. I've been looking forward to come out and seeing your operation for years. We've heard great things about it. And you referenced the tourism aspect. I know that you folks have received a lot of recognition as far as the quality of resource that you provide and the huge number of hunters that come out to enjoy, Ringneck Ranch. So very impressive. I'm looking forward to seeing it, as I know a lot of us are. So we'll look forward to the rain check. But thank you for your work. And I would add, I'm particularly impressed that your business model doesn't create a level of competition with other CSAs, but rather a level of collaboration to understand that as people get educated about the value of the resource you're providing, it ought to spread, and that rising tide ought to lift all ships. So I appreciate that openness to collaboration, and again, look forward to being out there with you and getting to see your operation before too long. Thank you.
But my personal perspective is that our competition isn't the operation down the road. It's stealing them from South Dakota and other places like that. That's where a big net of our activity is coming from.
Okay, any other questions for Keith?
This is Commissioner Spohr. For the other commissioners that may not know, I have visited Keith's operation a handful of times, and it is a first-class operation. And something that I have witnessed over the last decade is the popularity of the controlled shooting areas for the convenience of the outdoorsman. Everybody's looking for a little bit quicker deal that's a little bit easier, and that's just human nature. And that's where Keith comes in and provides a great experience for some people that may otherwise not have the access or the time to access, some of the other areas of Kansas. But thank you.
Commissioner Lauber, thank you all. Any other questions? Well, we'll get out to Keith's facility as soon as we can. Let's go ahead and have the next item, and then we might take a short break after that. 30 years of blue catfish management research.
Jason, can I share my screen?
Yes, I just made you a co-host, so you should be able to share it. Let me know if you can't.
Okay. All right. Well, I certainly appreciate the opportunity to come speak with you all. I'm kind of pulling double duty with this presentation. This is something that I put together for a virtual conference. It's coming up here in a couple of weeks now. But I worked with some other individuals in the fisheries division: Ernesto Flores, Craig Johnson, Nick Kramer, Brett Miller, Justin Morrison, John Reinke, Brian Sowards, Eli Sprinkle, and Scott Waters, to kind of get a bead on where we've been with blue catfish management and figure out where we're wanting to go. So none of this could have been done without a big group of people. Again, we're looking at 30 years of data, so we have a number of technicians and volunteers that assist with data collection. We're grateful for all of the funding that we've had to do this. We've had some great university collaborators. And of course, we're thankful for the anglers, because without their interest, we wouldn't be as interested in managing for these blue catfish. So trying to summarize this 30 years, we broke it down into four main groups here. We have stocking, harvest regulations, research, and then our future direction. And I'm going to start with stocking. So blue catfish are native to big rivers in the eastern part of the state, Kansas River, Missouri River, some of those tributaries. We've introduced blue catfish into 36 different impoundments since 1972, and they've been all around the state. When we look at these numbers, just kind of looking at how many we've stocked for each year, we start with this slug of fish in the 70s and early 80s, and these are mainly small impoundments. So we were putting these blue catfish in, trying to get these populations going in these impoundments. And we just didn't have very much luck with it. We didn't get a lot of return to the creel. We didn't see the fish in the samples. By and large, we just kind of learned that they didn't necessarily work in some of these smaller impoundments. Starting in 1990 and then through the early 90s, Milford Reservoir, became where we wanted to put these fish. Kind of put all of our eggs in this basket. We stocked this heavily for 4 or 5 years to see if we could get a population in a fishery. As we were kind of waiting on those to come along, we ended up having 3 additional large reservoirs. I believe this was John Redmond, Tuttle Creek, and Clinton, I think. But anyway, we had these 3 additional large reservoirs where we started putting fish in. And this was about the time where Milford really came on. We started seeing the fish in 2000, 2001, where they really started pushing through, started getting bigger, seeing natural reproduction. And correspondingly, anglers were starting to think about blue catfish too. And that led to where we're at now in the last 15 years, where we've introduced blue catfish into 16 additional reservoirs. And these have kind of ironed out to be our biggest impoundments. Currently in Kansas, we have active management of blue catfish in 16 impoundments. These range from about 2,000 acres to about 16,000 acres, mostly in the eastern part of the state, because that's where the biggest slug of our waters are. But by active management, these are places where we either have a special regulation or we sample these fish every year. We have stocking programs, but these seem to be the ones where we're kind of dialing it in. So next I want to hit on harvest regulations. The idea here was to review what we've done, justify what we've done to ourselves, see if that's the right approach, just kind of take a step back. And I want to start by mentioning the statewide regulations. So from 1990 to 2017, channel catfish and blue catfish were managed in aggregate. So we didn't differentiate between the 2 species. No minimum length limit, and we allowed harvest of 10 per day. In 2018, we, had obviously been recognizing the importance of blue catfish to these fisheries throughout the state. And we enacted we separated them from channel catfish, kept the no minimum length limit, and went to a 5 a day. So those are the statewide regulations, and we're currently on this no minimum length limit and 5 per day. So again, looking back 30 years ago, in 1990, we didn't have any special regulations. In 2000, we didn't have any special regulations. So 2005 kind of hit this turning point for blue catfish in Kansas, and there was 2 notable things that happened. The first was that our very first blue cat specific regulation was enacted. That was a 35-inch minimum length limit, 10 per day at El Dorado. And also a group of authors that included a lot of individuals, professors from the state universities. They recommended the blue catfish be a sink species. They noticed the low numbers and put it out there that these are a species that we might want to consider listing. So again, if you remember that graph of the stocking, this is where we started kind of putting more and more fish in. And by 2010, we had 5 impoundments that had special regulations. We had 1 lake that had a reduced creel, and we had 4 that had a minimum length limit and a reduced creel. In 2016, we had the first protected slot. That was at El Dorado. It was 25 to 35 inch, 5 fish a day, but only 2 could be over 35 inches. And by 2020, the beginning of this year, we had 14 lakes that had special blue cat regulations. We had 1 with a reduced creel, 10 with a minimum length limit and a reduced creel, and then 3 with a protected slot limit. So the minimum length limit that we use is a 35-inch and 5 a day. And the reason that we have that regulation is to try to develop these populations. The idea is that we're putting these fish in, they're not getting to reproductive maturity until, maybe as early as age 4 or 5, more likely probably 6 or 7. And we're wanting to protect these individuals through several spawns. We want to give them the best chance we can to get a naturally sustaining population so we don't have to keep supplementing with stockings. And the idea behind these, I have this 35 and 5, is to monitor the populations for natural reproduction. That's typically done in the summer with electrofishing. And then ultimately, this varies biologist to biologist, but generally the idea is to relax the regulation to allow harvest once the populations become self-sustaining. That seems to be the ultimate goal here. When we look at these protected slot length limits, we have 3 variants right now. We have the 25 to 35 with 5 per day and 2 over at El Dorado. We have a 25 to 40, 5 per day, 1 over at Milford, 32 to 40, 2 per day, 1 over at Wilson. And these are typically used when we have populations that have natural recruitment and a surplus of smaller fish. So what we're wanting to do is harvest some of these smaller fish in hopes of making these intermediate sized fish grow into trophy sizes. Now, this protected slot will only work in the situations where we're getting this natural reproduction, or we had a big stocking that took, or something along those lines where we just have a bunch of fish of smaller sizes. What I show here is these 3 impoundments, El Dorado, Milford, and Wilson. And what I'm wanting to demonstrate here is that we just have these different length frequencies. So what we're showing is, we have length down here on the x-axis and then proportion of catch. But what we can see is at El Dorado, we have a bunch of these 20-inch fish. A big old slug of those fish are 20 inches. We get into Milford, we have this, this big jump at about 10 inches, and we have this other big jump at around 16 inches. And then we get into Wilson and we see this big jump of fish somewhere in the, the 28 to 30 inch range. And these gray areas represent the slots. So the lengths that the slots are, and it shows that we have these bumps of fish on the other side of these slots and not very many fish within these slots. And that's what our hope is to get some of those fish thinned out on the left side and get them moving bigger and into these slot length limits where the anglers are wanting to catch them. So to highlight some of the research, each of these things that I'm going to talk about could stand alone, but in an effort to try to be kind of concise with it, we broke it down into 5 categories here. We have population dynamic studies, movements, diets, sampling methodology, and angler exploitation. When we're looking at population dynamics, this is something that we're doing a lot of right now. This is a very it's rudimentary fisheries science. This is the way that we understand how the populations work. And what we've learned is that blue catfish in Kansas exhibit fairly typical growth and mortality. Now, they don't really stand out from other populations throughout the range. An exception to this is Lovewell Reservoir. Ernesto Flores's thesis from Fort Hays State University dealt with this a little bit. And one thing that we saw is that these fish in Lovewell were growing much quicker than what we've seen in other populations, and they'd get up to 26 inches by age 6. But another thing that's showing up is a lot of inconsistent recruitment from both natural reproduction and stocking. Something that's come to light is that these fisheries may be supported by few year classes. We don't necessarily just have new fish contributing to the fishery every year. We might have just a big year class that comes through, and those are the fish that the anglers are kind of leaning on. And we're also seeing that growth may not be consistent between cohorts. We don't see the typical length at age relationship like we expect with some of these other species. And when we look at movements, again, we're seeing a lot of diversity here. We partnered with Kansas State University, did a project in 2012 and 13 at Milford Reservoir. And the fish really didn't move very much. And those were relatively dry years, but we didn't see fish that passed through the dam downstream, and we didn't see fish that moved up the river upstream. Conversely, we had a bunch of tagged fish out last year in 2019, which was a wet year, and we had movements upstream, pretty consistently. We had a lot of fish that were swimming 50 miles upstream before they were being caught by anglers. And we had a lot of instances where fish passed through the dam and were being targeted by anglers downstream. So what we kind of showed here is that these fish that are specific to a certain impoundment, they live long enough and they move far enough that they're going to be contributing to multiple fisheries throughout their life. A project that we're working with that's getting tidied up now with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, we looked at blue catfish movements in the Kansas River, and we saw that the Bowersock Dam seemed to provide an upstream barrier for these fish. So we had a lot of movement of these fish between the Missouri River and Kansas River, but coming upstream, they couldn't get above the Bowersock even during our historic high water levels. But we did see a lot of fish that moved downstream past the Bower Sock. And we also saw fish move upstream past the Johnson County Weir. And again, as I alluded to earlier, just the long lifespan of these fish and their movements really makes them contribute to multiple fisheries over the period of their life. We've done some diet work. We worked with Fort Hays State University on a project at Cheney and El Dorado. And what we saw there was that blue catfish were really dialing in on invertebrates. So they were eating a lot of bugs, maybe some crayfish. We did have evidence of an ontogenetic diet shift toward piscivory. So what we saw was as the fish get bigger, they're more likely to eat fish, is all that means. We saw a seasonal diet shift from detritus, so bottom gunk in June to fish in August on a project at Glen Elder, Lovewell, and Wilson. This is likely attributed to shad. So these fish are just kind of holding on and eating junk off the bottom and filtering nutrients from it until these shad become big enough for them to eat and gain caloric value. And it's worth noting that sport fish comprised less than 0.01% of blue catfish diets in summer months in Glen Elder, Lovewell, and Wilson. It was almost exclusively gizzard shad when they were eating fish. We've dived into sampling methodology a bit. That project referenced with Kansas State University did a lot of groundbreaking work on transmitter retention in catfish. It's very difficult. Fish tend to expel transmitters. Kansas State outlined some methodology to implant these and make them stay put. We've been working a lot with float line sampling. Target these large individuals seems to be a very effective means for getting our hands on big fish for agent growth analysis, or if we want to look at diets or just getting a handle on what we have. And we're also looking at comparison of aging structures. We need to know how old these fish are and how fast they're growing to properly manage them. To do that, we want to make sure that we're doing it as efficiently as we can. So we're trying to learn which structures are best, give us the best bang for our buck. Another thing we've dived into recently is angler exploitation. We saw this big increase in angler preference for blue catfish in the late 2000s. And it's very notable that in the licensed angler survey in 2006, blue catfish were not identified as an individual's favorite species, although common carp and freshwater drum were. So blue catfish were in essence less popular than these two species. And then in 2013, blue catfish jumped all the way up to the 6th most popular behind, and they were even ahead of species like bluegill, wiper, and smallmouth bass that, have typically contributed to angling popularity in Kansas. We currently have a licensed angler survey out now. The data are still coming in, but it's going to be interesting to see where blue catfish fall 7 years later. And along with this popularity, we saw big increases in catch. This isn't surprising, but it's just to kind of put it on here and show you what we're dealing with. But, we estimate a catch of 5,000 fish in 2009 in Milford, and up that 8 times in 2018 to an estimate of 40,000 fish caught. And the same thing at El Dorado. We went from approximately 800 individuals caught in 2007 to 4,200 in 2015. What I'm really wanting to highlight here is just how susceptible these larger fish are to anglers. Something that we've learned is just how good anglers are. I don't know if it's specific to these impoundments or to Kansas anglers or to what group, but we're seeing these bigger fish are being caught. The 3 largest fish we had tagged in Milford have all been caught and released at least once. One of those individuals was caught and released twice over a 2-year period. 23% of the overs that we've tagged at Milford, so 23% of the fish that we tagged over 40 inches have been caught at least once. When we're looking at harvest, we see more harvest in the Missouri River, and this is with that project at the University of Nebraska, and these data aren't finalized yet, but they're very close. We saw up to 82% harvest of these encountered fish. So it seems like once fish escape, make it to the Missouri River, folks are looking to harvest them. That isn't what we saw in the Kansas River. The Kansas River seems to have a pretty dedicated trophy angling base, and only 41% of the blue catfish that were encountered in the Kansas River were harvested. At Milford, what we saw is about 50% of legal fish that were captured. So tagged fish that people caught less than 25 inches or greater than 40 inches were harvested. That's about what we expected, that, you know, half the fish that were encountered were harvested. But something that kind of stuck out is we saw 19% of tagged fish greater than 25 inches were captured by anglers within 22 months. And this graph, what it is it's showing that at 25 inches, so we had about 20% of the 25-inch tagged fish that we had in the study had been captured by anglers. And once we get to these bigger fish, where we get to 40 inches, 45 inches, you know, we're getting 30% of these bigger fish have been caught, 60%, you know, up to 100%, which is the biggest fish that we had. But the take-home message here is that these large fish are vulnerable to harvest. And this isn't to say that anglers are harvesting them at every opportunity by any means, but every time a legal fish ends up on a hook, it has the potential to be harvested. And that's something that we need to wrap our heads around from a management standpoint, that these bigger fish are all available to harvest pretty readily throughout, you know, just a short couple-year period. Lastly, I'm just going to hit on future direction a bit. This was good, you know, theoretical discussions with the author group about what we know and where we want to go. And the group really wanted to focus on providing both harvest and trophy opportunities. And we're in a good spot to do that with blue catfish in Kansas. The idea is that we can get these fish harvested, that folks can harvest them, they can have enough to eat, you know, but then we can still get these big fish that people want to travel for. We're still struggling a little bit with fish sampling and trying to wrap our head around angler skill and how we make all this mesh. So we don't know exactly how abundant these large fish are because we don't know how effective our sampling is. We get a lot of reports of anglers catching these big fish, and it creates this perception that big fish are common, but it may just be that these anglers are actually just really good in targeting and capturing this small number of big fish. And we do have some projects in the works to try to address that coming up soon. Looking at the spatial scale of management, how to incorporate going through the dam, going upstream. You know, as I mentioned, these fish are occupying a lot of area. It may not be the most appropriate just to have a single regulation on a reservoir. That regulation may need to extend upstream 100 miles, or it may need to extend downstream if there's something we want to, you know, protect down there. We're curious about how the effects of climate change and reservoir aging are going to affect blue catfish. They're a relatively newcomer on the scene. They seem to be pretty adaptable to the reservoir aging that's occurring nationwide, more generalist than we originally thought. So seeing how these populations respond is going to be important. We want to learn what makes these populations tick. In some places, it seems like we can drop in a few thousand and, you know, we're seeing them reproduce and we're seeing big fish. And there's other places where we go through these, you know, fairly intensive stocking efforts and we're just not seeing the fish. So we're wanting to identify some reproduction and recruitment bottlenecks to see if we can identify where those may be to better allocate our resources. We talked about niche overlap. If these fish are all in the same area, they're all competing for the same resources, be it food or be it space. We want to see how these blue catfish interact with channel catfish. There's some talk about channel catfish numbers reducing with the presence of blue catfish. That seems to be an emerging trend in the South, where blue catfish have seemed to come on, you know, sooner than what we're having. And we're wanting to kind of identify that interaction. And we're also wanting to look at how they're overlapping with other pelagic predators, these big open water predators like walleye and wiper. We're wanting to see how they interact and if we stock blue catfish, if we're going to have negative effects on some of these other species. And lastly, we're always keeping our eyes open on management strategies for different populations. Every reservoir is different. So trying to do the best we can to manage each reservoirs individually while retaining ease of regulations to help, you know, make sure that it's not a unreachable goal. You know, we want anglers to be able to go and understand what they're seeing and be able to fish without worrying about all this. And that's the long and short of what I have. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about what we've been working on.
Gerald here. Thanks, Ben. Is there any evidence of hybridization between blues and channel cat?
There's not. That can occur. It's a very specific process that occurs, and it has to happen in a lab. It involves using a blender, and it's not something that occurs naturally, despite lots of efforts to make it happen naturally.
Any other questions for Ben?
This is Commissioner Spore. Is there any evidence, or is this just a myth that they do eat zebra mussels?
No, they do eat zebra mussels. It shows up kind of seasonally. It seems like in spring is when you really see a lot of them. They seem to be very opportunistic prior to these shad getting the age zero, the fresh shad, prior to those getting to 3 inches, say. They seem to be very opportunistic, and that's when we'll most likely find zebra mussels in their belly. But it's not to get hands on them that have crunchy stomachs.
Yeah. Gerald here. Can they eat enough zebra mussels to provide a remedial effect?
I don't have the answer to that question. I would have to defer to somebody that knew more about the zebra mussel dynamics. But I don't believe that we've seen that. There seems to be a lot more influencing zebra mussel dynamics than predation by blue catfish.
Ben, this is Emmerich Cross. I just want to pass on some compliments I've gotten here in the East region on our blue catfish program. There's a lot of people that are really happy with what we're doing statewide. So I passed it along to Doug Nygren, but I want to make sure you guys understand there's some folks here that are very happy with the program and appreciate what's going on there. And
That's great.
My question,
Thank you.
do you see this expanding, the program expanding any more in the state?
That's something that we talked about, the author list here, we talked about at length, and we're talking with individuals on our catfish committee about it as well. The general consensus seems to be no. I think what a lot of folks are wanting to do is kind of focus on these impoundments where the populations are showing some promise and trying to learn how to best manage them there rather than, putting our resources into introducing them into other populations. That said, I mean, there's nothing off the table. We've talked about introducing them in different reservoirs, and it just doesn't seem to be an immediate need right now.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gerald here. Any other questions for Ben?
Yeah, Commissioner Ryder here. I was just checking to see how you are feeling. What's your view about Milford? We made that decision a few years ago, and I don't know if you guys have got enough research on it, but it was kind of a controversial thing when we put in that pretty big slot limit, and what you're thinking about that.
Assuming the goal at Milford is still trophy fish, I think that's about as good as we could have done. So we're seeing these fish that are relatively slow growing. I think it's 10 years before they get to 25 inches there. So their growth is slowed as the population is expanded. It's not uncommon for them to live that long, of course, but we're still showing that big lump of fish underneath the slot and not very many in the slot. I think we're in a really good spot on Milford. I think that the regulation is, about perfect for what we're trying to accomplish there.
Okay, good deal. Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the commission or anybody?
Mr. Chair, I might make a comment. Brad Lovelace from Topeka. Thanks a lot, Ben. Very impressive presentation. And I think the commissioners have gotten a sense from this, the depth of understanding, the chronology of our efforts over the decades. You start out with a scattershot approach, but at this point, our folks have learned so much. There's more to learn, of course, but they've learned so much that they can be much more strategic in their recommendations for where we put these. Do we keep beating a dead horse Now that we recognize there's some dead horses out there in terms of blue catfish, bodies of water in the state. So a really great depth of understanding that's very impressive to me. I was with them down in Colorado a couple of weeks ago. And again, the more you see, the more you're impressed at the understanding that these folks have and the kind of professionalism that goes into their decision-making. One thing you might talk about just a minute, Ben, you with these slot length limits, identifying these big fish out there we're searching for. And of course, you're anxious for those fish to grow through the slot to get to those big sizes. It's really developed something that I hear about as I travel around the state. These people that fashion themselves now as trophy fishermen don't even think about keeping a fish, but they want to catch that trophy fish. Talk a little bit about development of this really new fishery in Kansas, would you?
Sure. And the slot limits are very finicky, I think is probably the best word. And you have to have a very specific scenario for them to be effective. And that scenario has to include a lot of little fish that are, I mean, a lot of little fish. And then you have to have the capability to grow big, and you have to have folks willing to harvest those little fish. So when we get in a lot of these other species, we just don't have the numbers of small fish for them to work. Blue catfish, on the other hand, when they reproduce, once they get going and they reproduce and they have what they need, they can create some huge year classes where we just get a big slug of these small fish that come through. Those of you that have fished for blue catfish, you know that they eat a lot. They aggressively eat. So when you get this big lump of fish and they're eating all these resources, it's just taking away from those trophy fish that a lot of anglers are looking for. So the hope is with these slots that we can harvest some of those fish, and that'll open up some of the resources so we can get those slots. And you're right, when you mentioned that folks are blue catfish, the mindset about them, I mean, even in the last 10 years, anecdotally has changed considerably. Catfish going from a food fish to a trophy fish, with these big tournaments going around and $50,000 boats. But we're wanting to create those opportunities where folks will travel to come in and they want to target those 30-inch fish, those 35-inch fish, with a chance of catching one that's going to, be a fish of a lifetime. And that's what we're trying to accomplish with these regulations. I want to reiterate how young we are in this process. It seems like a long time, but we're talking about, 30 years ago when we didn't have any interest in blue catfish whatsoever. And it's only been 15 years since we've had an initial regulation. So we're only dealing with a couple generations of fish and some of our older fisheries. So we have a lot going and a lot to look forward to.
Okay. Any other comments or questions?
Mr. Chairman, Mike Miller, Brad, I just think I want to add that I'm so impressed with the research our fisheries guys do and what they base their regulation recommendations on. If you add this to what, Scott Waters is doing and at Glen Elder and, maybe the program that Derek Schneiderwine presented about Milford Hatchery. I mean, these guys are doing a lot of work behind the scenes, and when they present recommendations to you, there's a lot that goes behind it. And I'm just continually impressed with what our fisheries staff do every day.
Commissioner Lauber, I agree. I think it really is excellent professionalism on their behalf, and it helps us make better decisions on our end because we know that they've done a good job in analyzing it. Is there any other questions for anybody? Then I'm going to propose that we take a 5-minute break and I've got 3:40. We'll come back here at 3:45. Can you handle that, Jason? Okay, then.
Yes, sorry, I've lost my page with my mute button.
That's all right. We're going to take a 5-minute break and then we'll be back.
Okay.
Thank you.
the blues.
How are you, Jason?
Oh, not too bad.
I can't tell whether I'm the only one unmuted or not.
I actually changed the setting for the commissioner so that you guys can actually unmute yourselves and mute yourselves now.
That would be good.
That's good. If I get tired of hearing myself talk. Everybody ready to start up again?
Ready to go.
All right. The IWEHA, Wes Sowards.
This is Wes Sowards, Wildlife Division Assistant Director and our Private Lands Coordinator. So I work on our walk-in hunting access program as well as our habitat programs, even into our Farm Bill contributory agreement with NRCS. So specific to the walk-in hunting program, I wanted to provide an update to the Commission on our efforts regarding the IWEHA program, or the Interactive Walk-in Hunting Access Program. So basically, through the years, walk-in hunting's been up. This is its 25th year. And throughout those 25 years, it became increasingly difficult enrolling tracks in eastern Kansas, near our urban areas, around Topeka, Manhattan, Lawrence, down around Wichita, and even over in Saline County. There's certainly some other counties that could fit into that. But so what we did in 2017, really in an effort to increase public hunting opportunities near our urban areas, we created what's known as this Interactive Walk-in Hunting Program. And really the whole concept behind this program was to allow us and the landowner the ability to limit use on their properties, because we saw through 20 years of trying to deliver this program, really the biggest limiting factor near our urban areas was overcrowding, that and safety concerns in some of these smaller tracks. So this program really allows us to put a limit on the number of hunters for each one of these individual tracks. So you get a more quality hunting experience. You have that, that certainty that if you check into one of these tracks, you will have the ability to hunt it exclusively in some cases. Some cases allows more than one hunter. But this format also allows the landowner to restrict certain activities, certain hunting methods, or require other special restrictions, like designated parking areas, don't block this field access entry. Certain things that we couldn't address before, we are now able to address some of these concerns with landowners through this program. And this program works through our iSportsman application. And you can find all of these IWEHA tracks, all of their stipulations, available species, dates on the KDWPT.isportsman.net website. And we will have an embedded map there with all of the property locations that link you to all the special rules as well. So this will not be in our printed atlas, just to reduce the confusion at this point in time until iWeHA becomes a little bit more recognizable. But it is on our online atlas, and they are marked in purple, hence all the purple I'll be using throughout this presentation. So really just to speak to the fact that this is not open fully to everybody as our walk-in hunting areas are. So there is some special requirements, and that requirement is a check-in and check-out through the iSportsman system. Jason, next. This gives you a little bit of an idea of what we're looking at in the fall 2019 through the spring 2020 hunting seasons. What we had here, this map you're looking at, yeah, right there, Jason. Basically the big circle in the top, that's our northeastern Kansas, around Topeka and Manhattan area. That's where most of the tracks exist at this point in time. And then down around Wichita, you see the smaller circle there. We've got several tracks there as well. And then we'll have more out in Saline County, like I mentioned before, this fall. So next slide, Jason. So as a hunter is checking into an area, you will get an original acknowledgement here that basically says any specific rules to this program that are outside of our public lands rules and regulations. So they sign off on these by clicking I accept, and that is basically signing off that there's a posted notice, a virtual posted notice in place that they agreed to. On the right-hand side of this screen, basically that's all of the tracks. That's what it looks like to them on their phone, and they can click each one of these. If it's showing up as red, you see those areas in red, that means somebody has checked into that property at that given point in time, and you will not be able to check in. Next slide. I mentioned having the ability to create acknowledgements or posted notice on different stipulations that the landowner has. And I do want to preface this by saying our biologists work directly with the landowner, and we start out with trying to offer the most opportunity possible. So most hunters we can get in there, the least restrictions possible, and we work back from there. So it is really a negotiation process between our wildlife biologists and the landowners. And we will walk away if the opportunity is not adequate. We're talking, you know, they only want one hunter in there on a 6,000 acre tract. It's probably not going to meet our obligations to offer public opportunities. So on this screen, you see some of the acknowledgements that will pop up for hunters. These are just some examples of some of the things that we can do with this program. We can close it on certain days. Like we have a church camp out in Franklin County, Camp Chippewa, and they want to close it on the weekends for other events that they're going to be having out there. So we're able to do that. We're able to close an area if the landowner lets us know if he's got to get in there to move cattle. We can do that, and we can let the hunter know through these acknowledgements why it's closed. So we can restrict to non-toxic shot. We do that on several of our properties. And then the big one that we do on several of them are to designate parking areas. That's another big concern for these farmers, and we are able to provide maps to hunters as they click through this on the website, that they can know very easily where those designated parking areas are. So everybody's in compliance, and the landowner's happy, and we continue on with the opportunity. Next slide. So we're going to take a look here at the 2019-2020 hunting season for iWeHA versus the 2018-19 season. So we saw incredible use, in my opinion, in 2018 and 19 with just over 1,100 check-ins from hunters, which was very good. We had about 30 to 40 tracks at that time, maybe 6,000 acres. So for what we had, really, really good response in year 2. Now, 2017, when we began, it started with about 1 or 2 tracks. So it was really just a pilot project at that point to see how it worked. But it was checked into on the first day that it was available that first year. So we knew we may have had something going here, and that was without any promotion at all. So we're amping that side of things up. And as you can see, this past fall and spring season, we had just under 4,000 check-ins through the end of the spring season. So we increased it by just about 300% in 1 year. Pretty tremendous use. My realistic goal for the year was 3,000 check-ins, and we beat that. So as you can see, in 2019, we had about 19 check-ins per day on these tracks, and compared to about 5 check-ins per day the year before. So really, really tremendous use. Next slide. So with that 4,000 check-ins, we're looking at 969 unique hunters that checked into these areas, just under 1,000 people utilizing this program really in year 2. So really tremendous job by our biologists to get this thing going with a lot of uncertainties in play. We really put together a pretty good product in my opinion. But one thing I wanted to see, and I pulled these numbers last year, the whole thing we thought we were developing was a low pressured hunting opportunity for people to have that unique opportunity on quality acres. So the best I could come up with to kind of gauge that would be acres per unique account. And as you can see, in 2019, each hunter had about a little over 11 acres to themselves theoretically. Whereas in 2018, they had about 18 acres to themselves. So it tells me that the program is really becoming popular. And at this point, we just need to focus on signing up new tracks and getting into some more long-term agreements. So, so really my goal is to try to keep that as close to about 20 acres per unique account that we can. So that's going to take a lot more acres in the next couple of years to do that. But I think we can accomplish that. So, so all this equates to is about 4.1 check-ins per hunter throughout the season, which is just phenomenal. They're not coming out there one time, getting displeased and walking away. They're coming back multiple times throughout the season to hunt multiple game, multiple opportunities. So, been really, really popular. Next slide. So broke it down by check-ins by activity. This was not surprising to me or our committee that helped develop this program. 68% of hunters or check-ins were devoted to archery deer hunting specifically. And that has a lot to do with the tracks that we have enrolled. These are real high quality tracks. A lot of them consist of riparian areas with some sort of woodland component. So they definitely favor deer hunting. And archery deer hunting specifically. So firearms deer saw the second highest percentage, about 13%, and then waterfowl hunting came in at 3rd, primarily because we have some really, really nice waterfowl hunting tracks with some nice setups that I'll get into here in a little bit when I highlight some of the tracks. So next slide. This again, a lot of the development that went into this program, it was designed to favor the resident hunter. In the past, this program for us was our special hunts on private lands program. So the same special hunts program that public lands has in place right now. We still have a couple properties in there. But what that did was it really restricted the ability to use the properties for residents. And I say that because applications were sometimes several months in advance. And this, we thought, having access to these properties at the click of your phone would definitely favor our resident hunters that have intimate knowledge of the area and our access programs. So, and it certainly has worked out that way. About 85% resident hunters utilize the iWeHA program to about 15% non-residents. Next slide. One of the things that we're able to do with this program is to really see what's going on with harvest. Something we've never really had a good handle on in our walk-in hunting program. A lot of that has to do with the scope of the project. You're looking at over 1 million acres consistently annually on the or on an annual basis. So we are able to get harvest reports, and each person who checks in, if they harvest an animal, they must report that in their checkout. So as you can see here, that our biggest species harvested was deer, at 60 deer harvested off of these 60 tracks. So pretty impressive number. And the top pie graph here is really, really small. Basically that's showing the breakdown between bucks and does. Bucks definitely held the majority of the deer harvested. So, and archery equipment carried the day for equipment use. So the other takeaways from here, a lot of different species of waterfowl harvested there again on our waterfowl specific properties. So really, really good harvest on some of these properties as well. So we know we have a really good idea that we're offering some pretty quality opportunities here, that these people are coming back and harvesting multiple game. Pretty cool to see. And it also, what it does, we have that ability to talk with our landowners now and let them know a little bit about the use that's happening out there. We don't have any standard structure to say, we're not sending out reports to landowners or anything like that. But if they request that from the biologist, we can pull it for them, and they'll have a little bit of an idea of what kind of harvest is happening out there, what kind of use they're having. And so far to date, even on our most highly used properties, I mean, some of these are getting used 30, 40 days in a row by people, and they are still ecstatic about the program and are continuing into this third year. So pretty cool to see that. And we're really losing no tracks from year to year. We're only gaining from here. So it's really working out for the most part. Next slide. Here's just a little bit of it gives you an idea of how much these properties get used. So about 36% of all of the tracks, as you can see, they're all laid out there. So there's about 15 tracks there, had greater than 50 check-ins. So they were getting used about every third or fourth day of the fall hunting season. So you're looking at over a third of all the tracks really getting steadily utilized and providing a really steady opportunity. Next slide. And this is just a little spreadsheet I put together, and this is specific to just the spring 2020 season that just finished up at the end of May. On the left-hand side, this is check-ins, and what I did here was just to provide us a little bit of a comparison on what kind of use we're seeing, what kind of harvest we're seeing. I did some comparison with some of our wildlife areas that are in ice sportsmen. So just for the spring 2020 season, iWeHA came in at the third highest area of total check-ins, just below Milford and Hillsdale, with comparable acreage to Milford. On the right-hand side, what you'll see is unique hunters. And iWeHA came in second to only Hillsdale in a very urban area at 191 unique hunters hunting spring turkey on iWeHA last year. And what's really cool is you look all the way to the right-hand side, and that's harvest. I will admit harvest is low for all areas, and I would definitely defer to some of our other folks as to why that may be. But Iweehaw came in as the second highest harvest for spring turkeys in our iSportsman system, only to Milford with 18 turkeys harvested. So, so really, really positive results when you compare it to public wildlife areas of similar size. But as we know, Iweehaw tracks are not one contiguous track like these public land areas. They're spread out all over the place. So one might expect it to look like this, but it definitely gives me some positive feedback that says we're going in the right direction. These are very popular. People are harvesting game and they're coming back multiple times. So really cool to see that. Next slide. And this is a little bit of a highlight I wanted to showcase for the commission. And this is a really good project that was done in cooperation with Harvey County Parks Department. Our biologist over in Wichita worked, I don't even want to guess how many hours he worked to secure this track. But if you're familiar, this is Harvey County East Lake. And what we were able to do with them was to open up the lake, a small portion of the lake, to waterfowl hunting. And we partnered with Delta Waterfowl, the local chapter there in Wichita. And they were able to volunteer their time and build 5 waterfowl blinds on this property. So each blind is set up an iSportsman as an individual track to check into, and you can check in on multiple people with you, 3 to 4 people that can come with you and enjoy that hunt that day. So you check in as the primary person and you will check out, but you can bring some kids with you, or family members or friends to sit in the blind with you, enjoy a day of waterfowl hunting. Also what we did was we signed up about a 40-acre tract, I believe. It might be a little smaller than that. Heavily wooded area with some ag ground adjacent to it that Harvey County owned and had never allowed hunting access on, as far as I can remember, as far as Charlie, our biologist in Wichita, can remember, and he's of retirement age. So, so this tract was opened up. Harvey County A was opened up only to archery deer hunting, and the response was absolutely tremendous in both the first 2 years of these being in the program. But switching back to Harvey B, the waterfowl property, there was almost 160 check-ins on those blinds throughout the season. I think the 48 total ducks harvested, I think it was a little bit higher than that. That might be, I forgot to update that number, but I'll bet you we're over 50 ducks harvested on that tract. Some of the interesting takeaways: hunters were from 30 different cities that came to hunt Harvey County East Lake, and from 12 different counties in Kansas. So they're getting, we relay this information right to Harvey County Parks, and I tell you what, they are just tickled pink. Their Parks Department, as well as their City Commission, are signing off on this every year. They obviously love the financial support, but they really, they love the additional opportunities they can offer to the public without all of the issues that come with completely 100% open access. So this has been a real tremendous story. Next slide. And here's a little excerpt from a magazine article that they're going to be expanding hunting on East Park this year. We've got 2 tracks, or 1 additional track that's owned by Harvey County. It's a 68-acre track that's going to be open for archery deer hunting. There again, another track that has not been open to hunting in years, if at all. So we're getting some really high quality stuff here. And really it comes down to the success of the first couple of years of the program. It's meeting everybody's needs, and really a cool opportunity. So we're getting more tracks in these areas where we haven't had any walk-in hunting of any substantial nature probably ever. So really cool to see. We've got some additional tracks being added around there, a big waterfowl hunting property just near Newton, from the same biologist, because he's able to see the real benefits of the program, and it's giving him more tools to go sell it. And we're just doing a tremendous job. Next slide. For this spring, what we want to do is take this momentum and follow up, make sure we have the best program rolled out to sportsmen and women that we can. So what we did, we initiated an iWeha hunter survey through our research shop there with Rich Schulteis in Emporia, with a really simple objective to figure out issues with the program, make improvements to the program, potentially assess the value that brings to local communities, and then to basically better understand the current hunter needs and desires. So we gave them that platform, and we got a tremendous response. Next page. Obviously, with this survey, we surveyed all people that checked into iWeha that we could. So it ended up to be about 946 unique hunters that we sent this survey to. We received 413 usable responses, which is about 44%, which blows almost every one of our surveys out of the water. Again, that has a lot to do with who we surveyed. We surveyed very specific people that utilized and know intimately about this program. So response rate was rather high, and that's a good thing. And the main topics that we focused on here, again, usage, experience, preferences for what they want to see added to the program in the future, and then just overall value of the program. Next slide. Here's some of the early information that we've got from the survey. You can see this graph. iWeha is just a little bit above our public lands. So the biggest one is private land there. They spent about 9 days hunting private land throughout the season. iWeha was about 5. And you can see traditional weha on the left, coming in at second to just private land in general. So there again, these people are specific to this iWeha program, so probably more apt to utilize that program as well as the traditional walk-in hunting program. So next slide. One of the things we asked was, to what degree has this introduction of this iWeha program affected your hunting activity? And what we saw was about 50% hunted more than they would have without it. You know, about 44% hunted about the same. They were able to keep up their regular hunting with this program. So really, really cool to see that about 85% of people hunted a little bit more or were able to hunt the same. So next slide. So one of the big things we wanted to get out of this program, and a lot of discussions, like I said, when we built it, centered around R3, recruitment, retention, reactivation of hunters. And we felt this program could really help to solve that issue about as good as anything. And what we're seeing from the survey data is we've done a little bit of that for sure. We were looking at about 30% of people were able to mentor somebody a little bit more than what they used to. Or we're able, like I said before, to continue to mentor people because they've got additional places to go. So really cool to see that we are affecting that side of things and getting more people hunting. And that I'm hoping that will only improve as we get more tracks, more promotion out there, and allow people to this opportunity. So next slide. So really, in summary, these are some of the takeaways, initial takeaways that we're going to be running with. We, as far as value, there's certainly an increase in hunter activity and mentoring, like I just mentioned. And it's well used by those that are aware of the program for obvious reasons. Characteristics, some of these things we originally built, we built some real small tracks into this program. If you're familiar with some of these urban areas, they're made up of much smaller tracks. A lot more landowners, a lot more non-resident landowners, but a lot of these opportunity for quality harvests. So, and one of the things we got out of this survey was they said 10 acres was exactly what they needed. Certainly prefer more, but 10 acres would certainly make them happy, and they're not going to shy away from the program when small tracts are in play. So that gives us a little fuel going forward, knowing that we're on the right path and can continue offering some incentives on those small tracts that offer really quality harvest opportunities. One of the other things we asked is, how far are you willing to go? We asked that a lot, and they consistently come back with about 75 to 100 miles. Obviously, we did have some non-resident responses that were a little bit bigger, but for the majority, we're looking at about 75 to 100 miles. And by the way we prioritized our counties, we're going to meet that in most cases. So, and like we thought, they do want more deer hunting opportunities. We're fully aware of that and committed to providing that opportunity. So, and we've identified some issues. Some issues we were aware of, some maybe not as much. Obviously, we need to improve some communication and messaging. Quite honestly, I didn't want to promote this program too heavily in the beginning when we had such a limited amount of area to spread these people out. So I didn't want it to totally fall apart to begin with, because too many people were trying to access these properties and not having the opportunity to do so because somebody else has checked in. So we're going to roll this out rather slowly, but the time is now to get some promotion out. There's no doubt that our responses indicate that. So there are some issues with people checking in without hunting. We were kind of aware of that originally, but most people that responded to this survey said they had the same concern. We're working kind of on our, what I would call our pie in the sky iSportsman program, our own offshoot potentially. And we're working some of these things in there with some potential ability to track people who check in without hunting, and some lottery type improvements to give people a better chance or an equal opportunity at getting on these properties. So the more equal opportunities we can provide, the better. To offer that guy who tries to access on the phone the same opportunity as that guy who's got the smartphone. We're not going to be able to fix all those things. It's pretty clear, but we're going to do our best to offer equal opportunities on these tracks. And another one is just law enforcement presence and enforcement. We've got our own basically education type thing that we have to provide our internal folks to continue to have a presence out there, and we've got that going for us as we go forward. But that we're certainly going to have to get everybody on board with this program to allow it to persist and continue to grow. So, next slide. So upcoming in fall 2020, like I said, we've got some new tracks in play this year. We've increased to 68 tracks at nearly 12,000 acres, which is similar to Tuttle Creek Wildlife Area, just to give you an idea. We've got a couple contracts in Johnson County, which I could talk to our biologist, but I would safely say we have never had any public access through our programs in Johnson County before. And we are able to work with the Johnson County Airport on a couple of really nice quality tracks there. So we'll see how those go this fall. We're working on a new tract in Saline County. And then really what we're going forward with now is the ability to have long-term iWeHA tracks through this new grant that we got from USDA NRCS. It is signed and approved, and we have the money to spend. We got $2.1 million through the Voluntary Public Access and Habitat Incentives Program, or VPA HIP. This is the third award that the state of Kansas has received. And we had 3 years to spend that money, and we're spending it on iWeHA properties as well as traditional WeHA properties. So it's my hope that this will give us a lot more iWeHA tracks in these urban areas, and have them long-term. So I think that's going to be really beneficial to this program going forward. that additional funding. So, and then with that, Jason, I've just got some eye candy, some pictures that were shared to me by hunters and biologists from the IWEHA program. This is the little guy on the right there. This is his dad's buck that he harvested, but the kid harvested an even bigger buck before this one on one of those Harvey County properties. So really cool. He sent that to me. He sent a picture of his son and just gushed and gushed about how great of an opportunity this program is. Next slide, Jason. And this is a really cool whitetail buck that was shot, I would say 1 to 2 miles from the Kansas Speedway, Kansas City. We've got a couple tracks there, like there again in Wyandotte County, where we've never had public access before. That, boy, this guy couldn't have said any more great things about the program. They're just real excited. Next slide. This is another deer harvested on IWEHA. Like I said, archery deer hunting was the most popular activity, and it showed. Next slide. Just another really nice deer. I think this is probably the biggest one reported through the system, shot in Clay County. Next slide. Couple nice deer that were harvested up in Atchison County on some properties. One resident and one non-resident hunter. So really, really good diverse opportunities. And I will end with the next slide. There's just a little positive reinforcement that that what we're doing is right for R3 and to recruit new hunters. This is a 14-year-old girl that shot this buck on one of our IWEHA properties in Riley County. So really cool to see that the fruits of our labor and what we're doing is actually helping to potentially recruit and retain hunters. So especially where our population is going. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Okay, any questions for Wes? Well, thanks. That was a thorough presentation, and keep it up.
Mr. Chairman, Mike Miller and Pratt, let me just add, there's a lot of really obvious benefits to this program, but I think a couple of them that Wes may not have mentioned is that this is continuing to let the WEHA program evolve and change and not become stale. And I think that's really important. It's also addressing obviously a group of people, a population that we haven't really taken care of before because we couldn't. But I think as hunters age like myself, I've mentioned this to Wes before, it's more important to me, the overall experience. So I want to know that there's not going to be 20 or 30 other hunters on an area when I go. If I know there's only going to be myself or 1 or 2 hunters, that right there is enough for me to want to do this. And I think that's maybe going to be the attraction to this as well. So this is just really exciting. And I'd love to see this grow and continue to evolve.
Thank you, Mike. Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you again, Wes. Let's move on to big game and wild turkey legal equipment and taking methods, some housekeeping. Kent?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In April, I guess I don't have a presentation, but I will refer commissioners to your briefing book item for this item. And you'll remember back in April, the commission voted to allow draw locks for vertical bows as legal equipment for big game, and this was under KAR 115-4-4. But basically we realized that it was also kind of inconsistent, or we didn't also change the turkey regulations coincidental to that. And so it was our desire to increase consistency across species and reduce unnecessary regulations. And so we're proposing to review the 2 following regulations. And the first is KAR 115-4-4A, which is wild turkey legal equipment and taking methods. And of course, this kind of deals with all the various components of legal equipment. But basically, it would be our recommendation to strike the language that does not allow draw locking devices for vertical bows under this regulation. As Levi mentioned in the discussion with 115-4-4, there are relatively few disabled hunters that apply for the draw locks each year, and that was across both big game and wild turkey hunting. And so we just feel that this is an unnecessary burden, and if typical hunters were to try and utilize this, that we wouldn't have an issue with that. And so our recommendation would be to strike that language from 115-4-4A, which is for wild turkey legal equipment. And then if that were done, then regarding the next regulation, which is KAR 115-18-7, which basically outlines the process for applying for disabled hunters to apply for and receive draw locks for big game and wild turkey. If the other change were made, then this regulation would not be needed at all. This process wouldn't be needed. And so we would then potentially just remove that regulation from the regulation book. Again, relatively few people have applied for these. Back in 2014, there were 8 applications. And again, this is across, both big game and wild turkey. That diminished to 5 in 2016. And then for the last several years, there's only been one recommendation or one application received from across the state for both big game and wild turkey. And so we really see this as an opportunity to reduce some of our regulations, reduce some language, and just as importantly, improve consistency across both big game and wild turkey regulations. So with that brief overview, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Gerald here. Is there any questions for Kent? Hearing none, let's move on to the workshop session. Kent, I guess you'll be back here in a little bit. Park regulations, Linda Landerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission and visiting public. I actually, for Kansas State Parks this time, we still are not recommending any changes to our regulations. I did want to update you a little bit on what's been going on in Kansas State Parks during this pandemic time. We've been very busy, continue to be very busy. We do feel like a little bit of the primitive camping has let up a little bit. It was the highest it's probably been in 2 decades as far as primitive camping. And to accommodate that, because we were so full in our utility sites, many of our state park locations made an area to where our customers could have their generator. So we have a generator site that we've put in an area to where it wouldn't bother others. And it's been very, very popular. Not all state parks has that yet, but many of them opened up primitive areas to generator only sites. So it was very popular. Our revenue continues to be strong. And I anticipate that at least through September, maybe into October, should the weather hold. A lot of different activities are going on in our state parks. We continue to be conscious of the size of our groups that come in and make sure that they social distance and wear masks when necessary. And so we have not encouraged any special events, but a few special events have taken place. And so as things kind of wind down in the camping season, we'll go back to our FEMA construction. So we have a lot of sites areas that need upgrades from the FEMA from last year, from the flooding process. So at this point, no regulation changes for Kansas State Parks. And thank you for allowing me to update you on our successful summer season. I'll take any questions if you have any.
Gerald here. Does anybody have any questions for Linda?
Linda, this is Emmerich Cross. So how long will it be before our parks are all back up from the flooding? Back up to repair?
Certainly. This is Linda Lanterman. We could go another year, 18 months easy before some of those sites are completely fixed. And the FEMA process is a long process. And so by the time you do your engineering and construction, it could take easy another 18 months.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Doug, fishing regulations.
Yes, good afternoon, commissioners. The first regulation that we have to discuss is our reference document, and it's authorized via 115-2514. This is where we have regulations that are different than the statewide regs for size limits, creel limits, possession limits, and seasons. So I've got a little bit of a list here, and it's going to take a little more time than normal maybe to go down through this, so bear with me. But Canopolis Reservoir is proposed to go to a 20-a-day creel limit on crappie. There's a new urban fishing opportunity in Junction City called Helen Pond, and we are establishing a new fishery at a new fishing location there with the addition of a 15-inch minimum length limit and a 5-a-day on largemouth bass and 5-a-day creel on channel catfish. Sherman County Smoky Gardens is a lake out in western Kansas that has just been renovated, and we established some regulations there by Secretary's order. It's open to fishing now. We want to convert that for next year from a Secretary's order and put it into the reference document. So those regulations are already in place right there at this time, but we just want to formalize them through the reference document for next year. And that would be a 15-inch minimum length limit and a 2-a-day creel limit on channel catfish, and a catch and release only for largemouth bass, bluegill, and red ear sunfish, as we're allowing that population to become established out there. It's really great to have that lake up and running again. There just isn't much fishing opportunity out there. So it's really good to see that. And our department's been really involved with the revitalization of that area and getting that fishery running again. So another relatively new relatively new community lake is Agra City Lake. And they're wanting an 18-inch minimum length limit and 2-a-day creel on largemouth bass in that relatively new location as well. Plainville Township Lake is requested to have an 18-inch minimum length limit and a 5-a-day creel on largemouth bass. And then the one that's going to take a little bit more time would be the next one. Does anybody have any questions about the ones I've mentioned so far? If not, then Jason, can you put I've got a couple of slides I want to show about the unique situation that we're working with on blue catfish in southeast Kansas. This will take a little explanation, but Seth Lundgren, our fisheries biologist, can we show the other slide first? Seth Lundgren, our fisheries biologist in southeast Kansas, has been in communication with Oklahoma biologists that manage Hula, Copan, Oologah, and Grand Lake. And this relates back to kind of what Ben was talking about with the success that we've had in Kansas with blue catfish. Well, Oklahoma's there, and they might be a decade ahead of us. These 4 reservoirs have really high density blue catfish populations, and as such, we are benefiting by a lot of those blue catfish coming across the border and frequenting our rivers that feed into those 4 reservoirs. After conversations with the folks in Oklahoma, we have decided that we want to give our anglers an opportunity to harvest more of these in the current 5-day creel. So our proposal would be to increase the creel limit in these 4 rivers and all their tributaries to 10 per day going forward, largely just to take advantage of an opportunity that has made itself available to us. There's so many fish in some of those reservoirs. I know Brad was out at El Dorado the other day and probably saw some pretty impressive numbers of electrofishing catch rates. You know, we'll get 200 or 300 per hour sometimes, but in some of these lakes in Oklahoma, they're electrofishing over 1,000 blue catfish an hour. And most of them are dominant. Those populations are oftentimes dominated by smaller fish, less than 18 inches. So Oklahoma's interested in seeing some harvest on these fish. And they've also seen, I think at Oologah and Copan, they've actually seen an impact to their channel catfish population. So they'd like to see the blue catfish cropped off a bit. If we make this change in Kansas, these maps will kind of show the rivers that would be affected by the new regulations. On the Neosho River, it'd go all the way to the John Redmond Dam and then up the tributaries. And then on the Verdigris River, you can see it goes all the way up to the Toronto Dam, and then the Caney and the Little Caney rivers would be included as well. So I think that's a great opportunity. It may be able to help Oklahoma reduce the populations a little bit, lessen the impact on some of their other fish, and give our anglers an opportunity to catch some more catfish. So that would mean that somebody fishing those rivers with this change could keep 10 channel catfish per day, 10 blue catfish per day, and 5 flatheads. So that's a lot of opportunity for somebody that wants to go down there and have a good time on these rivers and streams. One thing to note that most of these stretches are on private property. So some of this opportunity will exist on private property, but for the public, oftentimes it'll be where these rivers flow through towns or where there's low head dams. Those are going to be the locations where the anglers are really going to be able to take advantage of these more liberal limits on blue catfish. I think in Hula, they're actually contemplating going to 25 blue catfish a day on that lake down in Oklahoma. That's under consideration right now. So they're liberalizing as well. So I think it's an opportunity. But when Seth proposed this to our group, we ran this through the catfish committee that Ben had referred to earlier, and they reviewed it. But then I remembered hearing from our ecological services folks that they were seeing the same thing going on above Call Reservoir. And so we reached out to and talked with my staff a little bit about whether or not we should take a look at Call Reservoir and the rivers above Call that come up into Kansas. So if I can have the other map, please. Okay, so Call Reservoir, the upper end of the reservoir reaches up into the Call Wildlife Area in Kansas. It includes the Walnut River as well as the main stem of the Arkansas, and then the Ninneskah River and the South Fork of the Ninneskah River. Those are all influenced by the Call River blue catfish population. We're seeing more and more blue catfish coming up in these two rivers as well. However, I think our reason for wanting to be more liberal on this stretch above Call is targeted more at trying to not only give anglers an opportunity to harvest more fish, but also hopefully keeping some of the blue catfish numbers at a level that will be minimizing the impact they would have on some of our threatened and endangered species. And I would be more than happy if someone from our ecological services staff wanted to weigh in right now, to talk a little bit about what they've been seeing. But they've seen a pretty large increase over the last few years in blue catfish in the stream survey work that's been done in South Central Kansas on this stretch. So our proposal then would be for these 5 reservoirs in Oklahoma and the rivers above those would be to go to 10 per day on channel catfish for next year, which would be a liberalization. And I think the anglers will accept it and be an opportunity for people to just take advantage of what's really a wonderful resource. Any questions on that? Okay. If not, I have just a few more. City of Olpe, Jones Park Pond wants to create a youth minnow fishing location. So we're asking to make Jones Park Pond a youth minnow location that will allow opportunities for kids to fish in locations that we can stock a little heavier than what we normally would, and the minnow can fish with the child at those locations. They also had asked that we would restrict the use of cast nets and seining in the lake, and we've agreed to propose that to the commission as well. Emporia Jones Park Pond is another youth mentor fishing location that's been proposed, and also wants to limit the use of cast nets and seining at those small lakes, or just small park lakes in those 2 cities. Emporia Peter Pan Park is also asked to eliminate the use of cast nets and seining at their lake. Any questions on the youth mentor and the small lakes in the Emporia area? All right. Similar request came in from Johnson County. Johnson County has 2 lakes, Kill Creek Lake. They're both about 27, 28 acres in size. And right now they have regulations in place that don't really jive with the state regulations, and it makes it difficult for our law enforcement our law enforcement officers to enforce their regulations because they're different than what the state options are in many cases. And so what we've done is we've crafted a new paragraph that would go in the reference document specific to Johnson County Kill Creek Park and to Johnson County Lexington Park Pond. So those would fit into our reference document, similar to how we handle Wolf Creek, which is different than some of our other statewide options that our biologists used. So with that, I think that's really all I have on the reference document for next year.
Any questions for Doug on any of this? Okay, you want to go on?
I am going to let Chris Steffen take over for me now and discuss some of the A&S related regulation changes proposals that he has. And the first one is going to be the prohibited species list. Chris, take it away.
Thanks, Doug. As Doug said, my name is Chris Steffen. I am the Aquatic Nuisance Species Coordinator in the Emporia office. The first one we're going to cover is some changes to 115.18.10, which is our prohibited species list. The changes we are proposing there is to add some new species that the federal government added to their federal injurious species list in 2016. So the federal injurious species list prohibits importation into the country and movement between the lower 48 and Hawaii or Alaska, but it doesn't actually prohibit possession of those species within a state. So by adding these species to our list, it kind of closes that loophole where if these species made it into the state, they would be prohibited and you could ticket that. The species on the list that we're proposing to add are the Crucian carp, large-scale silver carp, Prussian carp, Wells catfish, Eurasian minnow, stone Morocco, European perch, Nile perch, roach, Amur sleeper, zander, and the yabby. These are all species that Fish and Wildlife Service has evaluated. They have proven invasive in other areas of the world and would be detrimental if they were wild in the US. So I'd take any questions on that section before I move on.
This is Gerald, do we have Wells catfish in the United States?
We do not. That's not something that, at least not in the wild, has made its way to the United States. I think the only one on this list that exists in the wild in reproducing number are the zander, and that's a very small population in North Dakota.
Which were intentionally introduced.
Yes, they were.
Okay. Any other questions? If not, go on.
Next section I want to cover is 115.7.10, fishing special provisions. As part of that is our list of A&S waters, those lakes where we have found white perch, zebra mussels, or Asian carp. This year we have 3 that we would like to add. We found white perch in Wichita South Lake late last year. July of this year, zebra mussels were found in Lynn Valley Lake, Main Lake, which is a private gated community lake. And then not on the paperwork, but we just confirmed last week, white perch and zebra mussels in Emerald Bay, which is another private lake in Wichita. So those are the 3 water bodies we would like to add to this list.
Any questions? All right, go on.
Next is 15.1.1 definitions. This is just some housekeeping and clarification we'd like to make to the non-sport fish definition. Currently, it just reads carp. We would like to clarify that to cover the multiple species of carp. So we would add common carp, silver carp, big head carp, black carp, and grass carp to that definition. Grass carp is currently listed as white amur, which is kind of an old term. So white amur would come off when we add grass carp under this proposal.
Okay, any questions? All right, go on.
This next one would be a change to 115.7.3, which is taking and use of bait fish or minnows. The way the regulations currently written allow the take of bait fish over 12 inches, except for gizzard shad. We had some questions from the public. Right now, on the Kansas River in particular, Asian carp are really common bait for catfishing. And so the way they can legally collect them, everyone typically uses a cast net. The issue is these Asian carp grow very quickly, and they quickly get above that 12-inch size that is on that regulation. As we have plenty of these fish and they're invasive, and these large fish typically don't live very long in a bucket, there's a very low risk. We just want to change that regulation so that anglers can take advantage of that opportunity to use those Asian carp for bait. So I'd take any questions on that one as well.
Any questions? All right, we have one more.
I think the next part will be covered by David Breath.
Okay.
There we go. David Breath was going to give a presentation about some license privilege changes, and he is at a wedding, and since we ran long, he's not going to be able to give the presentation, Gerald. So we do have a 9-minute video version of his presentation. If you are, if we could show that right now, that's getting close to 5 o'clock. I'll just leave it to you to decide if this is a good time to show that. If not, maybe we could do it in the evening session.
We have this presentation, we have a few more. Can you show that at the, are you going to be available in the evening session, Doug?
Yes.
Well, if you were going to be there, let's hold that off and we'll start the evening session with that and go ahead and try to get some of these other items done, if you don't mind.
That works.
All right. Let's move on to public land and cabin rates. Stuart Schrag.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Currently, the Public Lands Division operates 5 rental cabins on 4 properties. We have 1 cabin at Atchison State Fishing Lake, 1 at Ottawa State Fishing Lake, 1 at McPherson State Fishing Lake, and then 2 on Mineland Wildlife Area. These cabins have been there since 2007 to 2010. And during that time, they've always been at $70 for a nightly rental rate. As I said, these cabins are anywhere from 10 to 13 years old and are in need of extensive repairs and upgrades. Maintenance costs continue to climb. Maintenance and cleaning costs continue to climb. Basically, the $70 rental rate, nightly rental rate, is not keeping up with expenses, and we're operating currently in the red with our public lands cabin program. If you'll see in your briefing book, I provided some annual occupancy rates for these cabins that we currently still have. Ottawa State Fishing Lake is at 23%, McPherson State Fishing Lake at 26%, Atchison at 34%, and the two cabins at Mine Lands at 60 and 47%. So in looking at this big picture with operating in the red and looking at these annual occupancy rates, we went ahead and made the internal decision that we will stop rentals at Ottawa State Fishing Lake and McPherson State Fishing Lake. They will no longer be able to be rented by the public. We had done this a couple of years ago. We had two cabins at Kingman State Fishing Lake, and we closed those down for the same reasons. Operating in the red, very low occupancy rates. And these cabins do take a lot of my staff's time and takes away from their primary responsibilities as public lands managers. So currently we're going to asking for increase in rental rates for just Atchison and Mine Lands cabins. Let me back up a little bit. So the cabins at Ottawa and McPherson will be utilized as FTE office space, which is what we did for the ones at Kingman. We had two cabins there. One went to Clark State Fishing Lake for an office, and the other one went to Cali State Fishing Lake as an office where they were drastically needed. We've never had an office at McPherson State Fishing Lake, so we've never had an office at Maxwell Refuge, which is just down the road from McPherson State Fishing Lake. So that cabin will be relocated to Maxwell. The one at Ottawa will remain at where it's at and be utilized by FTE staff there. So it's really a twofold objective in making that decision. One, to stop the fiscal bleeding, if you will, and also to provide much needed office space for FTEs that we've never had. When we did our research on this, we made comparisons to local hotel lodging rates and also state park cabin rates. And so in looking at, along with our annual expenses that we face every year, and also the increased costs that we're facing as well, our recommendation is to increase nightly cabin rental rates at Atchison and Mine Lands from $70 a night to $105 a night. So with that, I would take any questions.
Is there any questions for Stuart? This is Gerald. It makes sense. If there's no questions, we'll move on.
Thank you.
Jake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. This is Jake George, Wildlife Division Director. This is the third time I've been before you with the falconry regulations, KAR 115, 11 through 15. There have not been any changes since the first two regarding what we're proposing to alter with the regulations. The main two changes are to remove the requirement for an inspection of facilities for renewals if the facility has not changed locations. So if you're a new falconer, you would have to have your facility inspected once you had it built. But if you are just an existing falconer who's renewing as a part of your application process, you no longer would have to have that facility inspected unless you were to move locations. The second big change was removing the requirement for permitted resident falconers to submit an application prior to attempting wild capture, and that is accepting peregrine capture. And that's basically, we already get a notification from the federal database when they file either their capture or release. They're limited to 2 wild captures per year already. And with respect to the peregrine, the reason there's an exception there is because that one is a federal allocation that we can't exceed on an annual basis. There can't be any more than 6 captured in the state. So the reason that it's only residents that no longer have to
Where did he go?
Jake froze up.
There he is. Jake.
Jake, we lost you for a second.
Oh, okay. Where did I end?
Only
You're talking about the
residents.
residents.
Okay, yeah, basically saying the difference, the reason that we had the residents that no longer have to submit an application prior to attempting wild capture is because we receive notification from the federal database anytime they capture or release wild birds. With the non-residents, we do not receive that notification from the database. So that's why they would still be required to submit the application prior to attempting wild capture. And with that, I would take any questions.
Are there any questions for Jake?
Commissioner Sill, the falconry is something that's new and different to me. So it's taken me a while to read through and even know what questions to ask. How many falconers are there that are permitted in the state right now, resident falconers?
We have 70 total permits currently.
70. And before they had to have that inspection, those permits were 3-year permits. So they had to have an inspection every 3 years.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. So just out of curiosity, because I compare this to like dog breeding facilities or something, things change in people's lives, health conditions, things like that, that affect their ability to maintain something that they were once quite good at and cared a great deal about. Is there any concern that in going from every 3 years to never, that there are going to be some facilities that slip through the cracks and become at a quality level that's harmful?
We had considered that. I will say that through the Kansas Hawking Club, they're a very tight-knit community. And I would say that as opposed to dog breeders, I don't think you could really compare it because as you've seen reading the regulations, it's like learning a different language. There's a lot that goes into falconry. People spend thousands of dollars on facilities and their birds. And I understand we have had in the past an issue that fit that exact example of someone failing in health condition and not keeping up with the facilities as they should have. And that was something that was reported to us by other members of the Hawking Club. And with respect to never, it's not necessarily never. We have the ability to go in and take a look at the facilities at any time.
Okay, so you're retaining that right to go in and inspect.
For certain, yes.
What about if somebody's permit's suspended or revoked? Is an inspection part of that renewal process then?
Yeah, I would not necessarily consider it a renewal because it would have lapsed at that point.
Okay, so if they've had a revocation or suspension, then an inspection would be appropriate.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks. I appreciate that. I learned some things through all of this.
This is Gerald. Any other questions? Any other questions for Jake?
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Kent?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sharing my screen now, and I will try to be relatively brief in this, but this is my usual presentation on the spring and fall turkey bag limits and season date recommendations. And sorry, this is Kent Fricky, Small Game Coordinator in Emporia. So first, I wanted to cover turkey season date recommendations. And as a quick reminder, the spring turkey season is set up to where youth disabled season starts on April 1st and gets a full weekend. The archery season begins the Monday after that first full weekend, and archery gets a full weekend. And then the regular season begins the Wednesday after that second full weekend in April and runs through the end of May. And in fall, as the commission will remember, last November, we changed the fall season to where beginning in 2020, rather than running from October 1st through January 31st, it is now a 41-day season open to all equipment from October 1st to November 10th. And so as a reminder, this is already ready to go for next year. For 2021, you see the season dates there. Youth disabled for April 1st through the 13th, archery the 5th through the 13th, and the regular season the April 14th to 31st, and then the fall season as I just described. And so in front of the commission now, this year is the recommendations for the 2022 seasons. And as you can see from the calendar, we're starting to shorten the time period where youth disabled still get 3 days and a full weekend. The archery season runs from the 4th to the 12th, and then the regular season starts on the 13th. And we're also recommending that we stick with the shortened fall season in 2022 as well. Now to our harvest updates. Again, I'll try to be brief with this. In 2019, these are the results of the fall. We sold about 4,600 permits for the fall season. Again, there are no game tags available in any portion of the state, so it's limited to 1 bird per hunter. And this 4,500 birds was a 19.8% decline from 2018. And so, as you can see from the carcass tags in the table at the bottom left, the fall season continues to see reduced participation. And I am double checking this number, but the active hunters this year, we estimated, was only 30% of people that bought permits. And so I'm again double checking that number, but as you'll recall, obviously the fall season has been the topic of discussion with the commission for several years now, but also because of the severe rains that we got and record-setting precipitation in 2019, I do wonder if a number of hunters just didn't want to think they have any additional adverse impact on the population because we saw such limited reproduction last year. But again, that's just a general thought. And you can kind of see the breakdown of residents versus non-residents as well. And so again, with those updated numbers, we see a severe decline this year in the fall harvest, and especially that active hunter number. But again, one that wasn't necessarily totally unexpected, but again, it was just a little more severe than I had anticipated. Moving on to the spring season, these were the dates from last year. And again, as a reminder for the commission, in 2020, after the commission vote back in November, we did reduce the bag limits in units 3, 5, and 6 to where no game tags were available. So you were only able to bag 1 bird from those 3 units. Plus the additional impacts of COVID-19 and travel restrictions. So as a quick brief reminder again, on April 10th, the governor signed an executive order to suspend the sale of general non-resident turkey permits. And then that was lifted at the very end of the season, May 27th. So non-residents who still sought to try and harvest a turkey in Kansas still had basically 1 weekend to harvest a bird. And whether this was, again, you can't totally isolate individual causes, but we certainly saw impacts from these decisions. Overall, we saw a reduction of about 25% in overall permit buyers. Residents actually increased 10%, which was nice to see. But again, a big hit to our non-residents, which declined of 77% non-resident permit buyers. And again, with the non-residents, typically for the spring season, non-residents make up 35 to 40% of our turkey hunters in the state, whereas this year we only saw 13% of the hunter population as non-residents. And I didn't do a full time look at this, but I suspect that most of those hunters, those 3,400 hunters that bought a permit, were likely, the vast majority were likely in that early archery season. But again, we did see increases in resident permits sold. Certainly saw decreases in game tags sold, but again, it was a little hard to determine the exact cause of that, whether that was because of increased travel restrictions, not only for, certainly for non-residents, but also residents just not traveling as far. So maybe not going into Western Kansas where that game tag was available. or if it was strictly a result of the reduction in those 3 units in the east and south central. And so of course, with fewer hunters afield, we did see an overall decrease in the number of turkeys that were harvested. Really the almost the exact same percentages or proportion of the population that was harvested were adult males, jakes, and then bearded hens. Those all fell within 1% of last year's proportions as well. And the overall hunter success remained really about the same, which was interesting to see. And I'll get into that for just in a moment. But again, certainly non-residents had a higher hunter success as in a typical year. But again, I suspect that most of those were hunting in the early archery season as well. But again, overall, a pretty good decline in the overall harvest of about 10,000 birds from 2019. And we see that decline here. Again, there will always be an asterisk next to 2020 due to those travel restrictions. But again, overall hunter success remains pretty similar. And I thought that was interesting given, that there were, significantly fewer turkey hunters afield. And so granted, our public lands saw about the same pressure. The residents kind of filled in the parking spaces that had been taken up by non-residents. But overall, you still have about a 50-50 chance of bagging a bird in Kansas. I just wanted to update everyone briefly too on overall population trends kind of at the statewide level. So on the left, this is from the Turkey Abundance Index from the spring Rural Mail Carrier Survey. So this is, just a general index of what hunters will be seeing in the field. We did see a slight decline from last year, and granted survey variability, but remember that last year in 2019, we did have severe impacts on the production side, which you see on the right here. And the estimates on the right do include this summer's, the July estimates. And so you'll see that statewide, we did see a bump up, which we certainly anticipated, but we're glad to see that we did see an increase in both young per adult and poults per 100 miles from last year's low. Now, granted, the issue then becomes how much of an impact do the number of adults have on the number of poults in the next year, but it was encouraging to see that for sure. And so the next 3 slides kind of look at, give kind of a cross section of the state. And so on the top, you'll see the spring abundance estimate. And then on the bottom, you'll see the poults per 100 miles. So you can kind of see the corresponding production from last year. And so this spring, we saw relatively stable numbers out west in both overall number of turkeys and the poult production. We did see kind of a continued decline in the Northwest that we'll certainly be keeping an eye on. I didn't necessarily expect that this year, but in general, it was, I think, an okay season out west for production this year in 2020. In central Kansas, you'll remember, and I'll direct you to the bottom right graph here, you'll remember this severe decline last year. Central Kansas really kind of took it in the shorts last year for production. And I think we see that in the upper graph in the reduced number of turkeys this spring. And so it was certainly good to see an increase in the central portion of the state in production. Again, west and certainly in the central, I thought we had really good years this year, ideal weather this year for production. And I think birds were taking advantage of that as much as they could. And then in the eastern portion of the state, again, in 2020, this spring, we saw some declines from those heavy rains and then just relatively stable production from and comparable to last year. So again, in under what I would consider relatively ideal conditions, we would like to see birds being able to take advantage a little bit more than we saw this year, but again, always look to next year. And then just briefly point out that this year, and I've presented this in past years as well, this year did continue this general decline in overall satisfaction with turkey hunting in the state. Again, everybody's got their own definition of whether they're satisfied or not, but we do see this decline, and we just kind of keep our finger on the pulse of this to determine, you know, where hunters are at and what they're seeing and how successful they are, and then striking that balance. For everyone that's familiar with our adaptive harvest strategy, of course, we made recommendations and made some changes last year. I just wanted to point out, these are the numbers that will be feeding into the adaptive harvest strategy this year. And again, after implementing a change, we always wait a couple of years to make any continued recommendations based on, you know, trends over time. And so with that, from the harvest strategy, again, we got those changes implemented, and we do not anticipate any changes based on the harvest strategy for this coming year. And so again, overall, no change is recommended for the 2021 bag limits. And you can see kind of the breakdown of how that falls out, again, with no game tags offered in the spring in units 3, 5, and 6. So again, there's the bag limit, no change recommended, and then no change recommended for the season dates in 22 as well. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Gerald here. Thank you, Kent. Does anybody have any questions for Kent? Well, I appreciate your report.
Absolutely.
And if that's it, why don't we go ahead and have Brad's secretary's remarks, and then we'll adjourn, or we will recess.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the commission. I'll update you on the agency fiscal status. We have begun preparation for our fiscal year 22 budget. So far, the word we've got from the governor's office is that our EDIF apportionment will remain the same at just over $5 million. If you recall, almost completely funded by permits and licenses, park fees and all that. And then we use that to leverage federal money, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the amount we do get from the state is from the lottery fund, the EDIF, and we felt very fortunate that they're planning. The projection is they'll give us that same $5 million amount split in about equal thirds between administrative functions, parks, and tourism. So we're hoping they hold to that, because we definitely depend on that money. As far as COVID-19, there has been offers from the federal government about helping to compensate us for the salary expenditures for COVID-19. We've gotten back about $66,000 in COVID-related salary costs so far, and there may be more coming. It's not a huge amount, but we appreciate it. Park fee funds in state parks finished up about 36% in fiscal year 2020 versus, which ended at the end of June, versus fiscal year 2019. Of course, 2019 impacted that spring from the severe flooding. Beginning of 2020 was impacted too, but to the Parks Division's credit, they maintained well, kept numbers up as high as they could. So we ended up in better shape at the end of 2020. Of course, we had a lot of expenses there. But we finished up strong. Our revenue for this spring, May and June, were at historic levels. We set records for our funding and had our first $2 million months ever. Now, that being said, expenses are up also. Heavy use, as you all are aware of, at our facilities, in all of our facilities across the agency, but in parks, we were particularly high. And so we really appreciate the higher use, and our parks folks have worked very hard to serve all the additional customer pressure. The current cash balance is up a little bit, just over $3.6 million, and that's about $200,000 higher than it was at this time last year. So we're going in the right direction. Cabin revenue for fiscal year 20 finished up 12% over the previous year. So that's good news too. So the parks are doing very well. As I said, they're working hard. They're being creative. To the question that came earlier to Linda Landerman, they're working very hard to restore properties. If you recall, about $10 million in damages from the extended flooding. We're working our way back, prioritizing, getting areas back that we can revitalize fastest first, and the tougher things, longer term, bigger investment, we're still working on. It'll just take us longer. Wildlife Fee Fund was up overall about 1% now versus this time last year. So that's also good news. We're concerned though, as we've talked about, with what'll happen this fall. I just got a text a little bit ago from an outfitter down South Central Kansas saying, hey, is there any indication that you guys are going to do away with non-resident hunters this fall? And he heard a rumor that the governor was indicating she might do that. And we have no indication of that at all. If you recall, our non-resident turkey season changed last spring because we got a lot of feedback from rural counties saying they were worried that non-residents would bring in the virus and cause health problems. So that was the pressure that built up to where we had to make that change. And we're hoping we can avoid that this year. One of the things I told that that outfitter was educate the local population. Let them know when those non-resident hunters come in, how isolated they are, how you take care of them, and how big of an economic impact that is for your area. So educate people so they add that dimension to their concerns and how they voice those concerns when this fall comes. We also are communicating with those non-resident hunters to let them know we're still looking forward to you coming. Still, if something comes up related to COVID where you can't come to Kansas, we'll give you a refund. But we're still planning on you coming. So we're trying to be clear with that. Now, a quick note about the federal funds, which of course we leverage using our state revenues. It's a pretty cloudy picture right now with how our federal funds are doing. And the main reason is, you may have recalled a few months ago, one of the things that the federal government allowed was deferred tax payments because of COVID, right? Well, those taxes are what we depend on, both from fishing revenues and boat gas revenues, as well as all the hunting revenues from guns and ammunition and all that. So because that's been deferred, our picture is cloudy as far as what we're going to receive. We believe, we hear, you've heard the same thing in the media, that gun, ammunition, archery revenues are all high. You go into a fishing tackle shop, the shelves are partially bare. So we believe sales are high and we believe the revenues are there, but they aren't showing up so far. The estimates we get so far indicate that for Dingle Johnson, our fishing, that the receipts are down about, let me look at the number here, I think it's about 3%. And then Pittman Robertson indicate that's our hunting. Indications are, as of the third quarter receipts that just came in, down about 22%. Of course, those numbers, that's our best numbers. So I'll share those with you with a big asterisk beside it because of the question about the deferred taxes. We asked and just got an answer today, as a matter of fact, when those taxes are due to be in, and their indication is they are deferred till this fall. So we should start seeing those, but you never know. In this climate, they may get deferred even later and not show up till next year. So that's a question mark. I've asked our folks, how do they manage that with that kind of uncertainty? And they're telling me that a little bit of a delay, as long as we're still fairly predictable, can be managed. It's when it extends, well into next year that we get into problems. So we're optimistic at this point that those revenues will be good. The taxes will be substantial coming to us, and we'll be able to run our programs but it's a little bit of an uncertainty right now, so we're having to hold our breath. Certainly back to our state revenues, we're depending on a good fall with the non-resident hunters, both deer especially, but also upland to a smaller degree, that they'll still come and still enjoy our resources and spend their money in Kansas. So that is our outlook for now, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Brad. Are there any questions for Secretary Lovelace? I have one general question. Are we allowing non-resident deer hunter refunds past the 14th of August?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've actually made some innovations, and I'll ask Mike Miller, my assistant secretary, to kind of chime in. He's been in the middle of a plan to try to make it easier for people to turn it in, but then not lose that revenue. So Mike, talk about that, would you please?
Yes, this is Mike Miller and Pratt, and working with our licensing staff, we did come up with a plan that if somebody requested a refund because of COVID, for whatever reason they couldn't travel this fall, we were going to refund their money, and then we were going to try to reissue that permit to whoever was next on the draw order. And at this point on the 14th, we put a deadline of August 14th, as you know, because we weren't sure what kind of demand there would be, what kind of pressure that would put on our licensing staff to do all that, plus provide refunds. As of the 14th, we had 49 permits that were returned. We had 29 of those that were reissued. We're still waiting. We're still pending on some of the others right now. So I think what we decided was we will take each of the refund requests on a case-by-case basis like we usually do. And if we can continue to provide refunds, once we get into the seasons, it becomes a little more difficult to provide a refund when the season that permit is valid for is already, on and going. So, but we will take each of them at a case-by-case basis right now.
This is Gerald here. Yeah, that sounds good. Any other questions for Brad or Mike? Okay, hearing none. We have 2 public hearing items tonight, and we have a brief film. I'm going to recess the meeting and reconvene at 6:30. Thank you. And I'm guessing, Jason, we just leave the meeting and then come back in like we did earlier today.
Yes, you can do that. I'll start the weight room just so people aren't coming in when we're gone. But yeah, I'll open it back up, 6:15 or so as people start showing back up.
Thank you.
Thank you.